buried trying to claw its way out of the earth. I should have felt something when I stepped inside. Grief, perhaps. Curiosity. Instead, what settled over me was a peculiar sense of recognition, as though I had walked these narrow hallways before, in dreams I couldn't quite remember upon waking. The house was exactly as he had left it. Furniture draped in white sheets like ghosts frozen mid-movement. Dust motes drifting through slanted beams of dying light. And everywhere, that smell. Old paper and wood smoke and something else beneath it all. Something organic and faintly sweet, like overripe fruit left to rot in a forgotten corner. I decided to stay. The apartment I'd been renting in the city was a temporary arrangement anyway. A holding pattern I'd maintained for years, without ever admitting I was waiting for something. This, I reasoned, was that something. A fresh start. A place to finally write the novel I'd been promising myself since graduate school. The first night, I slept in the guest room on the second floor, unable to bring myself to enter my uncle's bedroom at the end of the hall. The door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap, I could see only darkness, thick and absolute, the kind that seemed to have texture and weight. I told myself I would clean it out tomorrow. I told myself a lot of things those first few days. The doors began their strange behavior during my second week in the house. It started small. The door to the basement, a heavy oak thing with an iron latch that required genuine effort to open, I found standing wide open one morning, cold air seeping up from the darkness below like exhalation from a vast underground lung. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had latched it the night before. I remembered the metallic click, the resistance of the mechanism, the way I had tested it twice because something about that door made me uneasy. I latched it again, tested it 3 times. The next morning, it was open. I began to keep a journal of these occurrences, approaching the situation with the detached rationality of someone who refuses to acknowledge what is happening to them. The basement door, the pantry and the kitchen, the small door beneath the stairs that led to a crawl space I had never explored and felt no desire to investigate. Each morning, at least one of them would be open, no matter how carefully I had secured them the night before. I checked the locks. I examined the hinges. I even scattered flour on the floor in front of the basement door one night, expecting to find footprints or some evidence of an intruder. In the morning, the flour was undisturbed, a smooth white surface broken only by the geometric shadow of the open door. But it was the voice that truly began to unravel me. I first heard it on the 12th night. I was lying in bed, balanced on that delicate threshold between waking and sleep, when it came. A hoarse whisper from somewhere deep within the house, shaping itself around the syllables of my name. Not loud, almost tender, the way a parent might call to a child lost in a crowd. I sat upright, my heart hammering against my ribs, and listened. The house had fallen into that profound silence that only old structures can achieve, a silence that feels less like absence of sound and more like active suppression. I waited for what felt like hours, my body rigid with an attention that bordered on pain. Nothing. I convinced myself I had imagined it. The stress of relocation, the isolation, the strange atmosphere of this place that seemed to cling to my thoughts like cobwebs. I was simply exhausted, and exhausted minds play tricks. But the voice came again the next night, and the next. Each time it seemed closer. The first occurrence had seemed to originate from somewhere deep in the house, the basement perhaps, or one of the rooms on the first floor. By the 5th night, I could have sworn it came from just outside my bedroom door. By the 7th, I began to detect variations in that hoarse whisper, subtle emotional textures I couldn't quite name. Longing, perhaps, or hunger. I stopped sleeping in full darkness. I positioned lamps around my bed like sentinels, their warm glow holding back the shadows that seemed to grow thicker and more substantial with each passing night. I began conducting exhaustive searches of the house before bed, checking every room, every closet, every space large enough to conceal a human form. I found nothing except dust and my uncle's abandoned possessions, objects that seemed to watch me with the patient attention of witnesses. The paranoia settled over me gradually, a slow tide that I didn't notice until I was already submerged. I began to hear sounds during the day, footsteps in empty hallways, the creak of weight on floorboards in rooms I had just left. I would turn suddenly, convinced I had glimpsed movement in my peripheral vision, only to find myself alone with the dust motes and the watching furniture. The sensation of being observed became constant, a pressure between my shoulder blades that never fully dissipated. I called a friend from my old life, someone I hadn't spoken to in months. I tried to explain what was happening, but the words sounded absurd even as I spoke them. Doors opening by themselves. A voice in the night. I could hear the careful concern in my friend's responses, the way each sentence was constructed to avoid suggesting what was clearly being thought. That grief and isolation had finally broken something inside me. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps this was what it felt like to lose one's grip on reality. Not a dramatic shattering, but a slow erosion, like coastline surrendering to an endless sea. I began to research my uncle's history, searching for some explanation that might anchor these experiences to something rational. The town records were sparse, the local librarian unhelpful beyond polite formalities. But an elderly woman at the general store, her eyes sharp despite her years, mentioned something that lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. She spoke of my uncle in hushed tones, describing him as a man who had become increasingly reclusive over the decades. He would come to town less and less frequently, and when he did appear, he seemed distracted, his attention perpetually divided between the present moment and something invisible to everyone else. In his final years, she said, he had taken to talking to himself, or perhaps to someone else, someone no one else could see. The townspeople had assumed it was simple senility, the natural deterioration of a mind left too long in solitude. But there was something in the way she said it, something in the careful neutrality of her expression that suggested she believed otherwise. That night, I finally entered my uncle's bedroom. The door swung open at my touch, offering no resistance despite having stood closed since my arrival. The room beyond was smaller than I had expected, dominated by a narrow bed and a writing desk positioned beneath a window that looked out onto the dark woods. The surfaces were covered with papers, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, layered over one another in drifts that spilled onto the floor. I picked up the nearest sheet and angled it toward the lamplight. My uncle's handwriting covered every inch of available space, cramped and increasingly erratic as it progressed down the page. The text was a journal of sorts, describing experiences that mirrored my own with uncanny precision. Doors opening, a voice calling his name, a presence that grew closer with each passing night. But there was more. The entries detailed a terrible revelation that my uncle had reached after months of investigation. The house, he wrote, did not contain something supernatural. The house was something supernatural, or rather, it was a vessel, a container for a consciousness that predated the structure itself. This awareness had attached itself to my uncle upon his arrival, fed on his presence, his attention, his slowly unraveling sanity, and it had been waiting, all these years, for him to bring it someone new. The final entry was dated 3 months before his death, the day he had updated his will to ensure the house would pass to me. I stood in that narrow room, surrounded by the evidence of my uncle's descent into either madness or truth, and I felt the temperature drop. Not gradually, but all at once, as though someone had opened a door to winter itself. And then I heard it. My name, spoken in that hoarse whisper, but this time not from somewhere in the house. This time the voice came from directly behind me, so close that I could feel the disturbance of air against the back of my neck. I spun around. The room was empty, but the door I had left open, was now closed. And beyond it, I could hear something. Breathing. Slow and deliberate, matching the rhythm I had noticed in the walls during my first night in the house, the rhythm I had attributed to settling wood and temperature changes, and all the rational explanations we construct to keep the darkness at bay. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by a terror that transcended anything I had ever experienced. But gradually, incrementally, the breathing faded. The cold receded, and when I finally found the courage to open the door, the hallway beyond was empty, stretching away into shadows that seemed somehow deeper than before. That was 3 weeks ago. I am still in the house. I tell myself I stay because I have nowhere else to go, because the rational part of my mind still insists there must be an explanation. But there are moments, more frequent now, when I suspect the truth is simpler and more terrible. I stay because I can no longer leave. The house has claimed me, just as it claimed my uncle, and my departure would only delay an inevitable return. The voice comes every night now, no longer a whisper, but something closer to speech. It tells me things, about the house, about my uncle, about myself. Things I could not possibly know, but which feel true in some deep and inexpressible way. Sometimes I answer. Sometimes we talk for hours. This invisible presence and I, our conversation stretching through the darkness until the first gray light of dawn forces it back into whatever space it occupies between the walls, beneath the floors, within the very structure of this breathing, watching, remembering place. Am I losing my mind? Perhaps. Probably. The distinction between madness and truth has become academic, a philosophical puzzle I no longer have the capacity to solve. What I know is this: the doors still open by themselves, inviting me toward parts of the house I have not yet explored. The voice still calls my name, and with each passing night, it sounds less like something separate from me and more like an echo of my own thoughts, reflected back from a depth I cannot fathom. Last night, for the first time, I did not hear the voice. Instead, I spoke. I called out into the darkness of the house, shaping my words around a name I should not know, could not know, and yet which came to my lips with the effortless familiarity of something I had known all my life. And from somewhere in the walls, from somewhere in the space between this world and whatever lies beneath it, something answered. The sound was my own voice. I found a mirror in the basement this morning, its surface covered with 40 years of dust. When I wiped it clean, the face that stared back at me was not quite my own. The features were the same eyes, the same jaw, the same expression of exhausted bewilderment. But there was something in the way the reflection moved, a fraction of a second's delay that should not have been possible. I raised my hand. My reflection smiled. I have not left the house since. The thought of what I might find waiting for me beyond those trees, at the end of that long gravel road, terrifies me more than anything inside these walls. Here, at least, I understand the nature of my confinement. Here, at least I am not alone. Tonight, I will not lock the doors. There seems very little point now. The house remembers everything. And now I think, so do I. Story 2. The first time I noticed them, I convinced myself they were condensation. Just moisture from my breath meeting the cold glass, forming shapes that my tired mind interpreted as fingers. That's what I told myself as I stood in the kitchen at 3 a.m., staring at the window above the sink, at the smeared impressions that stretched far too high against the frost-bitten pane. I had been in the cabin for exactly 11 days. The decision to leave the city hadn't been impulsive. Years of fluorescent lights, concrete corridors, and the endless mechanical hum of civilization had hollowed something out of me. My therapist called it burnout. My ex-wife called it abandonment. I called it survival. When I found the listing for a remote cabin in the mountains of Colorado, no neighbors for 7 miles, no cell service, just pine trees and silence, I didn't hesitate. I signed the lease that same afternoon. The drive up took nearly 4 hours from Denver, the last 45 minutes on an unpaved road that wound through dense forest like a serpent's spine. The cabin itself was modest. 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows on every wall. The previous tenant, an elderly man who had lived there for 30 years, had passed away in his sleep 6 months prior. Peacefully, the landlord assured me, as though I had asked. The furniture remained. A worn leather armchair, a pine table with deep scratches across its surface, and a bed frame made of logs so heavy I couldn't imagine how they'd gotten it through the door. For the first week, I found exactly what I'd been looking for. Silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. Mornings spent watching mist rise from the valley below. Evenings reading by the fire, the only sounds the crackling of logs and the occasional creak of old wood settling. I stopped checking my watch, stopped dreaming of deadlines and divorce papers. I slept deeper than I had in years. Then, on the 8th night, I woke to the sound of footsteps, not the delicate tread of an animal. These were heavy, deliberate steps, the kind that press into frozen ground and snap brittle twigs. They circled the cabin slowly, methodically, as though whoever, or whatever, was out there, was examining each wall, each window, each entry point. I lay frozen in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs, listening as the steps completed their circuit. Once, twice, 3 times. Then nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. In the morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin, searching for tracks in the frost. The ground was disturbed, that much was clear, but the impressions were strange. They looked almost like footprints, but elongated, the heel dug deeper than any normal gait would produce, as though someone had been walking on their toes, or as though something very tall had been taking very careful steps. I told myself it was a bear, a moose, some large animal investigating human territory. The mountain was full of wildlife. I'd seen deer grazing at the tree line just days before. There was nothing unnatural about nocturnal visitors, nothing to warrant the cold dread that had settled into my stomach like a stone. That evening, I double-checked the locks on every door and window. I slept with the fire burning and the poker within arm's reach. The footsteps returned. This time they were slower, more patient. I could hear whatever was out there pause at each window, lingering for several seconds before moving on. There was a weight to those pauses, an intentionality that made my skin prickle. It wasn't investigating, it was watching. When I finally gathered the courage to look, peering through the bedroom curtain with trembling hands, I saw only darkness. The moon had hidden behind clouds, and the forest beyond the glass was an impenetrable wall of shadow. But in the morning, I found the first handprint. It was on the kitchen window, perfectly preserved in the thin layer of ice that coated the exterior glass. A hand, unmistakably human in shape, with long, slender fingers and a palm roughly the size of a dinner plate. The top of it was nearly 8 feet from the ground. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at that impossible mark. I'm not a short man. I stand at 6'2", and even stretching my arm above my head, I couldn't reach that height. Whatever had made that print was either standing on something, there were no ladder marks, no disturbances in the snow beneath the window, or it was something that simply should not exist. That was when the doubt began. The mind, I've learned, is a fragile instrument. Under stress, it invents, it projects, it fills silence with whispers and shadows with shapes. I knew this. I had read about auditory hallucinations, about how isolation could warp perception, about how the human brain, desperate for pattern and meaning, could conjure terrors from nothing at all. Perhaps the footsteps were simply the cabin settling, the old wood contracting in the cold. Perhaps the handprints were there all along, left by the previous tenant, and I had only now noticed them. But the prints kept appearing. Every night the footsteps circled. Every morning new marks decorated the windows. Sometimes they were just fingers, pressed against the glass as though testing its strength. Sometimes they were full handprints, smeared downward like something had been dragging itself along the wall, and they were always higher. Each day, they crept further up the windows, further beyond the reach of anything that walked on 2 legs. I stopped sleeping through the night. I stopped eating regular meals. I would sit in the armchair by the fire, staring at the darkness beyond the windows, waiting for something to stare back. The silence that had once felt like medicine now pressed against my eardrums like a physical force. Every creak of the floorboards made me flinch. Every gust of wind sent my heart racing. On the 15th night, I tried something different. Instead of hiding, I waited by the window. I pressed my back against the cold log wall, held my breath, and listened as the footsteps began their familiar circuit. They paused at the kitchen window, then the bathroom, then the bedroom, and then they stopped, directly on the other side of the wall from where I stood. I could hear breathing, low, rhythmic, impossibly slow. Each exhale seemed to last for 30 seconds, a long, rattling susurration that vibrated through the wood and into my bones. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But my legs had turned to stone, and my voice had retreated somewhere deep inside my chest where I couldn't find it. And then, very softly, something tapped on the window beside me. 3 times. Patient, almost polite. I did not look. I squeezed my eyes shut like a child hiding from monsters, and I did not look. Eventually, the footsteps resumed. They circled once more and then faded into the forest, leaving me alone with the thundering of my own pulse. I should have left. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to pack my bags, get in my car, and drive back to civilization. But something held me there. Stubbornness, perhaps, or pride. I had come to this mountain to escape fear, the fear of failure, of loneliness, of a life that had slipped beyond my control. To run now would be an admission that the fear had followed me, that there was no escape. So I stayed. I started keeping a journal. I told myself it was for clarity, to separate real events from imagined ones. But as the days passed, the entries became increasingly erratic. I would write about seeing movement in the trees during daylight, tall shapes flickering between the trunks, only to find no evidence of disturbance when I went to investigate. I recorded instances of waking to find the furniture rearranged, the armchair facing the window instead of the fire, the table pushed against the door, the poker missing from its hook. I always found it later, usually somewhere impossible. Behind the woodpile, beneath the bed, once even outside, standing upright in the snow like a grave marker. Was I moving these things in my sleep? Had the isolation finally cracked something fundamental in my mind? I called the landlord from the general store in town, the only place within 20 miles that had a working phone. I asked about the previous tenant, about his final months in the cabin. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, in a voice that had lost some of its earlier warmth, the landlord said the old man had become paranoid near the end. He had boarded up some of the windows. He had stopped coming into town for supplies. When they found him, the cabin was filled with notes, hundreds of them covering every surface, all containing the same words, written over and over again. The landlord wouldn't tell me what the words said. He just suggested gently that maybe the mountain wasn't for everyone. I am writing this on my 32nd night in the cabin. The handprints have reached the roof. I can hear them now. Not just the footsteps, but the hands, dragging across the shingles above my head. Something is crawling up there, circling, waiting. The breathing has grown louder. It no longer stays outside. Sometimes I hear it in the walls. Sometimes I hear it in the space between my own heartbeats, as though it has slipped inside me when I wasn't paying attention. I found a loose floorboard this morning. Beneath it was a box filled with the old man's notes. The landlord was wrong. It wasn't the same words. It was the same sentence, written in handwriting that grew increasingly frantic toward the bottom of each page. It only comes inside when you look. I have not looked through the windows in 3 days. I have covered them all with blankets, with newspaper, with anything I could find. The tapping has become more insistent. 3 knocks, then 5, then 7. It wants my attention. It wants me to see. But here is what frightens me most, what keeps me awake even as my body begs for rest. This morning, I woke to find dirt on my hands, pine needles in my hair. My feet were caked with mud. And there, on the inside of the kitchen window, the window I covered myself, the window I haven't touched since, was a single handprint. It was exactly my size. I do not know anymore if I am being hunted or if I am the hunter. I do not know if the thing in the forest is real, or if it lives only in the broken corridors of my mind. All I know is that when I press my palm against that print on the glass, it matches perfectly. And somewhere outside, in the cold darkness between the pines, something is waiting for me to remember what I've done. Story 3. The house smelled wrong. Not unpleasant exactly. More like someone else's memory of what a home should smell like. a faint trace of lavender mixing with something older, something that had soaked into the walls long before the fresh coat of paint tried to seal it away. I noticed it the moment I crossed the threshold that first Friday evening, boxes stacked in the moving truck behind me, the autumn wind carrying dead leaves across the porch like fleeing witnesses. I told myself it was nothing. Old houses carry the weight of their previous inhabitants in ways that newer constructions never do. This Victorian, with its high ceilings and ornate moldings, had stood for over a century. Of course, it would have its own particular atmosphere, but by Sunday morning, I understood the smell was the least of my concerns. The bathroom mirror was the first to betray me. I remember the precise moment with a clarity that still makes my hands tremble when I hold my razor. I had just finished shaving, wiping the last traces of foam from my jaw, when I noticed my reflection's left hand was lower than my own, just slightly, a difference of perhaps an inch. I froze, raised my hand deliberately. The reflection matched. I lowered it. The reflection followed, perfectly synchronized. I laughed at myself then, a nervous sound that echoed off the tile walls. Sleep deprivation. The stress of moving. My mind playing tricks born from exhaustion, and the disorientation of waking in unfamiliar rooms. I convinced myself so thoroughly that I had almost forgotten about it by lunchtime. Almost. That evening I caught it again in the hallway mirror, a large gilt-framed piece that the previous owners had left behind, mounted at the end of the corridor where it captured light from the west-facing window. I was walking toward the kitchen when I saw my reflection in my peripheral vision. Something made me stop. Something made me turn and look directly. My reflection stood still for a fraction of a second after I did. The delay was so brief that it could have been nothing. A trick of the fading light, a momentary glitch in my perception, but I felt it in my chest. That primal recognition of wrongness that predates language, that ancient alarm system designed to alert us when something in our environment doesn't belong. I approached the mirror slowly, watching my double approach me in turn. Step for step, we moved together. I raised my right arm. It raised its right arm. I touched my face. It touched its face. Everything was precisely as it should be. But its eyes seemed to reach the position a heartbeat before my own did. The following week, I developed habits I am not proud of. I began avoiding mirrors when possible, taking the long way around the hallway rather than past the gilt-framed glass. I shaved by touch, keeping my gaze fixed on the shower tiles behind me, rather than risk the bathroom mirror. When I had to look, when social convention demanded I check my appearance before a video call with my colleagues, I did so quickly, refusing to linger, refusing to give my reflection time to do anything unexpected. This, I told myself, was a reasonable response to stress. The move had been significant. Leaving the city apartment where I had lived for nearly a decade, buying a house in this small town where I knew no one, beginning an entirely remote position with a company whose employees I would likely never meet in person. These were major life changes. Anxiety manifested in countless ways. Perhaps for me, it had chosen to manifest as a peculiar fixation on mirrors. I almost believed it. Then I came home on Thursday and found the living room mirror facing the wrong direction. The piece was modest, a simple rectangular frame in weathered oak, hanging above the fireplace mantel. I had positioned it myself during that first weekend of unpacking, angling it slightly to catch the light from the bay window. Now it had shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone else would have noticed. But I knew. I knew because I had been so careful. I knew because I had measured the angle with a level app on my phone, wanting the reflection to capture the autumn colors of the maple tree outside. The mirror now faced the interior of the room. It reflected the doorway to the hall. It reflected the space where I stood each evening to remove my coat. It reflected me. I found myself standing very still, coat half removed, staring at my own image across the room. The distance between us was perhaps 15 feet. Far enough that details softened, that expressions became difficult to read. My reflection stood in the same pose, coat hanging from one arm, body twisted toward the fireplace. We watched each other. I cannot say how long we remained like that. Time had become unreliable in ways I was only beginning to understand. But at some point I became aware that I had stopped breathing, that my lungs were burning with the need for air, and I forced myself to inhale, to break the spell, to look away. When I glanced back, my reflection was turning away at the same moment. But for an instant, for the briefest slice of time, I could have sworn it was turning toward me. I called my brother that weekend. We were not close in the way that siblings sometimes are, but we maintained the rituals of family, calls on birthdays, visits during holidays, the occasional text message checking in on life's larger movements. I did not tell him about the mirrors. I told him about the house, about work, about the town with its single grocery store and its church with a steeple visible from every street. We talked about our parents, about his children whom I had not seen in over a year. Normal conversation, grounding conversation. But when he asked if I was happy, I hesitated. I was not unhappy, I said finally. The house was beautiful. The solitude was peaceful. I was adjusting. He said I sounded tired. I said I was not sleeping well. This was true. I had begun waking at odd hours, pulled from dreams I could not remember by a sense of presence, of observation. I would lie in the darkness of my bedroom, listening to the house settle around me, and I would feel certain, absolutely certain, that something was watching from the vanity mirror across the room. I had considered covering it. I had considered removing every reflective surface from the house entirely, but that would mean admitting something was wrong, and I was not ready to admit that. The incident in the study happened on the third week. I had been working late, absorbed in a project that demanded more concentration than I could reliably give, when I became aware of movement in my peripheral vision. The study contained a single small mirror, an antique piece I had inherited from my grandmother, its silver backing mottled with age. I kept it on a shelf behind my desk, more for sentiment than function, positioned at an angle that should have reflected only the ceiling and a portion of the bookshelf. Should have. I turned slowly, not wanting to see, knowing I would see anyway. My reflection looked back at me from the spotted glass. But the angle was wrong. I was not positioned where the reflection showed me. The mirror should have been showing books and crown molding. Instead, it showed my face, my shoulders, my hands resting on an invisible desk. And my reflection was not looking at me. It was looking at something beside me, something in the room, something I could not see. I spun around, heart slamming against my ribs, eyes searching the shadows of the study. Nothing. There was nothing. Just bookcases and papers and the soft glow of my desk lamp casting long shadows across the floor. I was alone. When I turned back to the mirror, my reflection was watching me again. Expression neutral, posture relaxed. But there was something in its eyes that looked like satisfaction. I began keeping a journal. This is not something I had ever done before, but I needed documentation. I needed proof, for myself, if no one else, that these events were occurring, that my perception was not fundamentally broken, that I was not becoming someone who could no longer trust his own senses. The entries are difficult to read now. They chart a progression I did not want to acknowledge at the time. The small discrepancies becoming larger, the delays becoming longer, the reflection's behavior becoming increasingly independent of my own. I wrote about seeing my image blink when I had not blinked. I wrote about catching a smile on its face that I had not worn. I wrote about the terrible moment when I raised my hand to wave and my reflection raised the wrong hand. Deliberately, mockingly, as if testing the boundaries of what it could do. I also wrote about my attempts at rational explanation. Carbon monoxide. I theorized. I bought a detector. The levels were normal. Neurological issues. I visited a doctor in the next town over, complaining of visual disturbances. The examination found nothing. The scans showed a healthy brain. Stress-induced psychosis. I researched the symptoms, compared them to my own experience. The fit was imperfect. I was not hearing voices. I was not experiencing delusions of persecution or grandeur. I simply could not trust my reflection. Perhaps that was its own kind of madness. By the 5th week, I had covered every mirror in the house. I used sheets and towels and old curtains I found in the basement. I told myself it was temporary. a measure to restore my peace of mind while I figured out what was happening. But the truth was simpler and more disturbing. I had become afraid of my own face. Not my face exactly. The face that wore my features, but no longer seemed to be mine. The coverings helped for a time. Without constant visual confirmation of the discrepancies, I could almost convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Days passed in relative normalcy. I worked, I ate, I slept better than I had in weeks. The house felt lighter, as though removing the mirrors had removed some invisible weight that had been pressing down upon it. But I still felt watched. I felt it in the bathroom, where the sheet over the mirror seemed to bulge slightly toward me when I showered. I felt it in the hallway, where the covered gilt frame seemed to pulse with something that might have been patience. I felt it in my study, where my grandmother's mirror sat beneath a pillowcase, its antique surface hidden but not silent, not still, not entirely contained. On the night everything changed, I was sitting in the living room, reading by lamplight, when I heard a sound from behind the fireplace mantel. A soft sound, the whisper of fabric against glass. I looked up to find the sheet sliding from the mirror, falling to the floor in a heap of white linen, revealing the reflective surface beneath. And in that surface, I saw myself sitting in the armchair, book in hand, lamp glowing beside me. But my reflection was not reading. My reflection was standing. My reflection was standing at the very edge of the glass, pressing its palms against the barrier between us, its face inches from the surface, its eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that stopped my breath in my throat. Its mouth was moving, forming words I could not hear, and its expression was one of desperate, furious longing, the expression of something that has waited too long and can wait no longer. I could not move. I could not speak. I could only sit there, paralyzed, watching myself watch me from the other side of the glass. And then my reflection smiled. It stepped back from the surface. It returned to the armchair that mirrored my own. It picked up a book that mirrored mine, and it began to read, posture perfect, movements fluid, as though the last 30 seconds had never occurred. But just before it lowered its eyes to the page, it looked at me one final time, and it winked. I am writing this from a motel room 3 towns away. I left that night with nothing but my laptop and my car keys, driving until the shaking in my hands became manageable, until the image of that smile stopped replaying behind my eyes. I have not returned to the house. I do not know if I ever will. Sometimes in the small bathroom of this temporary refuge, I catch myself avoiding the mirror above the sink. Sometimes I see my reflection moving in ways that might be slightly delayed, slightly independent, slightly wrong. I tell myself it is paranoia. I tell myself that what happened in that house has left marks on my mind that will take time to heal. But late at night, when sleep refuses to come, I find myself wondering, was it the house? Was it the mirrors themselves, old glass holding old reflections, somehow bleeding through into the present? Or was it something that has always been there, waiting inside every reflection I have ever cast, finally awakened by circumstances I do not understand? I study my hands in the dim light of the motel lamp. I watch them flex and close, entirely under my control. At least I think they are under my control. But when I look up at the black screen of the television across the room, that dark glass that captures just enough light to show me a ghostly version of myself, I cannot shake the feeling that I am being studied in return, that something is learning, that something is waiting, and that the next time I look into a mirror, it might not be my face looking back at all. Story 4. It started 3 weeks ago, or maybe it started years before that, and I simply wasn't paying attention. That's the thing about dread. It doesn't announce itself. It seeps in through the cracks, through the narrow spaces between what you know and what you refuse to see. The first time I heard it, I convinced myself it was the house settling. Old pipes, the neighbor's cat prowling outside. Anything but what it actually sounded like. Someone standing behind my bedroom door, drawing slow, deliberate breaths in the darkness. I live alone. I've lived alone for 8 months now, ever since my wife left. She took the furniture, the paintings, even the shower curtain. What she couldn't take was the silence, or what I thought was silence, before I learned to listen more carefully. My bedroom sits at the end of a narrow hallway on the second floor. The door is original to the house, solid oak with brass hinges that haven't been oiled in decades. When I bought this place, the realtor called it full of character. She failed to mention that character sometimes breathes. That first night, I was lying in bed reading when I decided to turn off the lamp. The room plunged into familiar darkness, the kind that wraps around you like a second skin. I closed my eyes, and then I heard it. A slow, wet inhalation, the sound of lungs filling with air on the other side of the door. Not rushed, not panicked. Patient, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there had been waiting for this precise moment. I held my breath, my heart thudding against my ribs. The sound continued. Inhale, pause, exhale. Inhale, pause, exhale. A rhythm that seemed almost meditative, almost human, but stretched somehow, elongated in ways that made my skin prickle. I reached for the lamp and twisted the switch. Light flooded the room, pushing shadows into corners. I stared at the door. It was open, just a crack, maybe 2 inches at most. I could have sworn I'd closed it before bed. I always close it. It's a habit from childhood, a small ritual that separates the sanctuary of sleep from everything else. I got up, checked the hallway. Nothing. The house was still, the air undisturbed. I closed the door firmly, pressing until I heard the latch click, and went back to bed. The next night, it happened again. Sleep became a negotiation. I started leaving the hallway light on, a dim amber glow that filtered through the gap beneath the door. I told myself it was practical, easier to navigate if I needed the bathroom, but we both knew the truth, the house and I. I was afraid of the dark now, afraid of what waited in it. The breathing continued every night without fail, always after I turned off the lamp. Always that same measured cadence, like a metronome counting down to something I couldn't name. And every morning, when I finally worked up the courage to check, the door would be open wider than I'd left it. 1 inch, 2 inches, once, almost a foot. I installed a lock, a heavy deadbolt that required a key from both sides. That night I locked myself in, placed the key on my nightstand and waited. The breathing came at 2:47 a.m. I know because I was staring at the clock, watching the minutes crawl past like insects. But this time, something was different. This time, it was louder, closer, as if whatever was out there had pressed its face against the wood, its mouth inches from the gap. I didn't move. I couldn't move. I lay there, rigid as a corpse, listening to that obscene rhythm while sweat soaked through my sheets. When morning came, the door was still locked, but it was open, just a sliver, just enough to let a blade of hallway light cut across my floor. The deadbolt was still engaged. The key was still on my nightstand. And yet, somehow, the door had opened anyway. I called a locksmith that afternoon. He examined the mechanism, tested the frame, measured the gaps. Everything was in working order, he assured me. Doors don't just open on their own. There must be a draft somewhere, a pressure differential between rooms. I nodded and paid him, and didn't mention the breathing. By the second week, I'd stopped sleeping in the bedroom entirely. I moved to the couch in the living room, surrounded by windows and streetlight, and the distant comfort of passing cars. But the house has a way of contracting at night, of folding in on itself until every room feels like that hallway, that door, that gap. I could still hear it from downstairs. Muffled now, but unmistakable. The rhythm followed me through the floorboards, through the walls. It didn't matter where I slept. It knew where I was. I started researching. Sleep disorders, auditory hallucinations, the tricks an exhausted mind can play on itself. Hypnagogia, they call it, that liminal state between waking and dreaming where the brain invents sounds, visions, entire conversations that never happened. Maybe that was it. Maybe the breathing was just my subconscious, manifesting anxiety into something I could hear. But that didn't explain the door. I set up cameras, 3 of them, positioned to capture the bedroom from multiple angles. I watched the footage every morning, scrubbing through hours of nothing, waiting for proof of something. What I found was worse than nothing. The cameras showed me sleeping. They showed the door, closed and latched. And then, at precisely 2:47 a.m. every night, the footage would glitch. Just for a second. A burst of static, a flutter of corrupted frames. When the image stabilized, the door would be open. No motion, no transition. Closed, then open, like a jump cut in a film. I watched that moment 100 times. I slowed it down, frame by frame, until my eyes ached from the screen. There was nothing in the static. Nothing visible anyway. Just distortion and darkness, and the faint suggestion of movement that might have been my imagination. The third week brought changes I couldn't ignore. I started finding things moved in the morning. Small things at first. A glass shifted to the other side of the counter, a book turned face down, the bathroom mirror fogged as if someone had been breathing on it. Nothing dramatic, nothing that couldn't be explained by absent-mindedness or half-remembered actions in the fog of exhaustion. But then I noticed the photographs. I keep a few framed pictures in the living room, mostly landscapes, a couple from my wedding that I haven't gotten around to removing. One morning, I found them all turned to face the wall. Not knocked over, turned. Deliberately rotated on their hooks so that the images pointed away, leaving only the brown paper backing visible. I fixed them. The next morning, they were turned again. The third time it happened, I left them. There didn't seem to be any point in fighting it. My reflection started to look wrong, not dramatically different. I didn't sprout horns or lose my face, but something in the mirror didn't quite match. A delay in movement, perhaps. A fraction of a second where my reflection continued an action I'd already completed. Or an expression that didn't align with what I felt. I'd catch myself smiling in the glass, but I wasn't smiling. My face was slack, exhausted, hollow-eyed. The reflection grinned anyway. I stopped looking at mirrors. I covered the one in the bathroom with a towel and angled the others toward walls. I told myself it was just fatigue, just the accumulated weight of sleepless nights crushing my perception into something unreliable. But at night, when the breathing started, I could hear something else beneath it now. A second sound, almost inaudible, threaded through the rhythm of inhale and exhale. It took me 3 nights to recognize it. Whispering. I couldn't make out words. The voice, if it was a voice, seemed to come from very far away, or from somewhere inside my own skull. It rose and fell with the breathing, a sibilant undercurrent that scratched at the edges of comprehension. Sometimes I thought I heard my name. Sometimes I thought I heard my wife's voice, speaking in that disappointed tone she used near the end. Sometimes I heard my own voice, asking questions I didn't remember wanting to ask. Who's there? What do you want? Why won't you let me sleep? The whispering never answered. It just continued, patient and persistent, as the door drifted open inch by inch. I called my brother last Tuesday. We hadn't spoken in months. He lives on the other coast, consumed by his own life, his own problems. But I needed to hear another human voice. Needed someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. He listened as I explained the breathing, the door, the photographs. He didn't interrupt, didn't dismiss me with platitudes. When I finished, there was a long silence on the line. He asked if I'd been sleeping. I told him I had, a few hours here and there. He asked if I'd been drinking. I said no more than usual. He asked if I'd considered seeing someone, a doctor, a therapist, anyone who might help me process the divorce. I said I'd think about it. What I didn't tell him was that I'd started leaving notes for myself around the house. Instructions, really. You live alone. The breathing isn't real. The door opens because of air pressure. You are not being watched. I'd find them in the morning, right where I'd left them. But sometimes the handwriting looked different. Shakier. Less like mine. Sometimes there were responses scrawled beneath my words in that same trembling script. Are you sure? I don't remember writing those. I don't remember a lot of things anymore. Time has become unreliable, a series of jump cuts no different from the camera footage. I blink and hours evaporate. I close my eyes for a moment and wake up in rooms I don't recall entering, staring at doors I don't recall opening. The breathing follows me everywhere now, not just at night. I hear it during the day, in the spaces between sounds. The hum of the refrigerator, the drone of traffic, the white noise of existence. Underneath it all, that wet, patient rhythm. Last night I decided to do something I'd been avoiding since this started. I decided to stay awake, keep the light on, and watch the door myself. No cameras, no recordings, just me and the darkness and whatever was out there. I sat in the corner of my bedroom with a flashlight in my lap and every light in the house blazing. I drank coffee until my hands shook, until my heart raced and my thoughts skittered like insects across glass. I waited. At 2:47 a.m., every light in the house went out at once. I fumbled for the flashlight, my fingers numb and clumsy. The beam cut through the darkness, and I pointed it at the door. It was open, wider than I'd ever seen it, nearly a foot now, a gap large enough for something to slip through. And in that gap, just for a moment, I saw something. Not a face, not a figure. Just the suggestion of presence. A density in the darkness, a shadow that seemed more solid than the others. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It watched me. The flashlight flickered and died. When the power came back on, seconds later, minutes later, I couldn't tell. The door was closed, latched, locked. But on my nightstand, next to the useless key, there was a photograph I'd never seen before. A Polaroid, faded and yellowed with age. It showed my bedroom, taken from the hallway, through a door that was open just a crack. And in the bed, barely visible in the darkness of the image, there was someone sleeping. It looked like me. It wore my face, my expression, my posture. But it was smiling. I'm writing this in the morning light, sitting in my kitchen with all the curtains open, and the radio playing loud enough to drown out anything else. The photograph is in front of me. I've been staring at it for an hour, trying to convince myself it's a trick, a fabrication, a symptom of a mind finally unraveling under the weight of sleeplessness and solitude. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. The breathing hasn't stopped. It's there now, beneath the radio static, beneath the hum of the refrigerator, beneath my own ragged pulse. It's been there all along, and the door to my bedroom, at the end of that narrow hallway, is open. Just a crack, just enough to see through. I don't know if something has been coming in. I'm starting to wonder if something has been trying to get out. If the thing that breathes in the darkness isn't outside the door at all, but inside me, inside this house, inside the narrow spaces between what I remember and what I've done. The photographs are still facing the wall. My reflection still smiles when I don't. And somewhere in this house, a door keeps opening that I keep closing, following a rhythm I can no longer ignore. Tonight, I won't fight it. Tonight, I'll leave the door open. And maybe finally I'll see what's been watching me all along. Or maybe I'll discover I've been watching myself. The door is open now, just a crack. And I can hear something breathing. It sounds exactly like me. Story 5. The first notification came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. I remember because I was already awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me like an old man lowering himself into a chair. The phone buzzed against my nightstand, its pale light cutting through the darkness. Motion detected. Attic camera. I live alone. The attic access, a narrow hatch in the hallway ceiling, has been padlocked from the outside since I moved in 8 months ago. The previous owner left the lock and I never saw any reason to remove it. I should explain why I installed the cameras in the first place. It wasn't paranoia then, not like it is now. The neighborhood had experienced a string of break-ins over the summer. Nothing violent, just petty theft. Lawn equipment, packages from porches, a bicycle here and there. The police suggested security systems. I ordered a kit online, 6 cameras, motion sensors, an app that promised peace of mind. I mounted them myself on a Saturday afternoon. Front door, back door, garage, living room, basement stairs, and one in the attic. The attic camera was an afterthought. I had an extra unit, and the attic seemed like a logical place. Burglars sometimes enter through roofs, I reasoned. I climbed up there once just to install it, and found nothing remarkable. Exposed insulation, old ductwork, a few cardboard boxes left by previous occupants. Dust motes floated in the beam of my flashlight like tiny planets orbiting a dying star. I mounted the camera in the corner, angled toward the hatch, and climbed back down. I snapped the padlock shut and didn't think about it again. Until that first notification. I told myself it was a glitch. The cameras were cheap, the software cheaper. Motion detection algorithms are imperfect. They're triggered by shadows, by changes in light, by nothing at all. I checked the footage anyway, squinting at my phone screen in the dark. The attic looked exactly as I'd left it. Gray and grainy in the night vision mode. The insulation a pale sea of fiberglass, the boxes hunched in the corner like sleeping animals. Nothing moved. I watched the 30-second clip 3 times, then set my phone down and tried to sleep. The second notification came the following night. Same time, 3:47 a.m. I was awake again, though I couldn't say why. My body had begun to anticipate it, I think, the way you learn to wake moments before an alarm. I checked the footage. Still nothing. Just the attic, frozen and silent, a photograph pretending to be a video. By the 5th night, I had stopped sleeping entirely. The human mind, I've learned, is a poor judge of its own reliability. We trust our perceptions because we have no alternative, but perception is a story we tell ourselves, edited, compressed, full of gaps we paper over with assumption. I began to notice things I hadn't before. Small things. The way certain shadows in my house seemed to linger a moment too long when I turned on lights. The faint smell of something organic, not rot exactly, but close, that would appear in the hallway beneath the attic hatch and vanish before I could trace its source. The sensation, persistent and maddening, of being watched from just beyond the edge of my vision. I started keeping notes. I bought a cheap notebook from the drugstore and documented every notification, every timestamp, every anomaly I observed. The pattern was always the same. 3:47 a.m. Motion detected. Nothing visible on camera. I began to wonder if the camera itself was malfunctioning, if some electrical hiccup was generating false positives at the same moment every night. But when I tested it during the day, waving my hand in front of the lens, it worked perfectly. The notifications came only at night, only at 3:47. I called a friend, a former colleague who knew something about electronics, and described the problem in vague terms. He suggested interference, maybe from a neighboring router or a faulty wire. He told me to check the attic for rodents. Animals, he said, sometimes nest in insulation. Their body heat can trigger motion sensors. The thought of climbing back into that space made my stomach clench, but I forced myself to do it. I waited until midday, when sunlight poured through the small ventilation window and the attic seemed almost mundane. I unlocked the padlock, unfolded the ladder, and pulled myself up through the hatch. Everything looked the same. Dust, insulation, boxes. The camera blinked its small red eye at me from the corner. I searched for signs of animal activity, droppings, gnaw marks, disturbed insulation, and found nothing. The boxes were still sealed with packing tape, yellowed but intact. I even opened one, half expecting to find something inside, but it contained only old magazines and a set of ceramic dishes wrapped in newspaper from 1987. I was about to climb back down when I noticed the marks. They were faint, so faint I might have imagined them, but they seemed to form a path through the dust on the floor. Not footprints exactly, more like drag marks, as if something had been pulled across the surface. They led from the far corner of the attic where the shadows pooled thickest, toward the hatch where I stood. I stared at them for a long time, then I climbed down, locked the hatch, and didn't go back up. The notifications continued. I stopped checking the footage after the second week. What was the point? There was never anything to see, and watching those gray, empty clips had begun to feel like a ritual I performed for an audience I couldn't identify. Instead, I started listening. The house, I discovered, had its own language. I learned to distinguish the creak of cooling pipes from the groan of settling foundations, the tap of branches against windows from the scratch of something else, something that seemed to come from directly above my head when I lay in bed at night. It wasn't constant. It came in bursts, a faint scraping, like fingernails drawn slowly across wood, followed by silence so absolute it felt artificial. I would hold my breath and strain to hear, and just when I convinced myself I had imagined it, the sound would return. I began sleeping with the lights on. Then I stopped sleeping in the bedroom altogether and moved to the couch, as far from the attic hatch as I could get without leaving the house. I told myself this was reasonable. I told myself I was being cautious, not crazy. The distinction I was beginning to realize was thinner than I had ever imagined. 3 weeks after the first notification, I woke to find the padlock on the attic hatch hanging open. I had checked it before bed. I was certain of that. I had developed the habit of checking it multiple times a day, running my fingers over the cold metal, tugging at the shackle to confirm it was secure. But when I walked into the hallway that morning, the lock dangled from the hasp like a broken promise. I stood beneath the hatch for what felt like hours, staring up at that dark rectangle of wood and the ladder folded against it. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. I had forgotten to lock it. I had sleepwalked. The mechanism was faulty. But another part, the part that had been growing stronger every night, feeding on sleeplessness and shadows, whispered something different. It whispered that I hadn't forgotten anything, that something had opened the lock from inside. That day, I installed a camera in the hallway, aimed directly at the hatch. I reinforced the padlock with a second one, then a third. I strung a length of fishing line across the hatch itself, thin enough to be invisible but strong enough that I would hear it snap if anything pushed through. Then I sat on the couch and watched the feed on my laptop, determined to catch whatever was happening. At 3:47 a.m., the attic camera detected motion. I switched to the hallway feed and watched the hatch, my heart hammering against my ribs. The fishing line didn't move. The locks didn't move. Nothing moved. But when I checked the attic footage, I saw something where the shadows gathered. There was something new. A shape. It was indistinct, more suggestion than substance, like a smudge on the lens or a trick of the compression algorithm. But it hadn't been there before. I was certain of that. I had watched hundreds of these clips, and that corner had always been empty. I zoomed in, pixel by pixel, until the image dissolved into meaningless noise. When I zoomed back out, the shape was gone. I've stopped leaving the house. Food delivery services bring groceries to my door. I wait until I hear them drive away before I open it. My employer has granted me medical leave. Exhaustion, I told them, which isn't entirely a lie. I spend my days watching the cameras and my nights listening to the sounds above my head. The scraping has grown louder. Sometimes I think I hear breathing, slow, deliberate, like someone conserving energy for something they've been waiting a long time to do. I've thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That my security camera detects motion in a locked room? That I see shapes in the shadows that vanish when I look directly at them? They would think I was losing my mind. Maybe I am. I've started to question my own notes. The timestamps don't always match my memories. There are entries in handwriting that looks like mine, but that I don't remember making. Last night I found a sentence at the bottom of a page that made me go cold. It knows you're watching. I didn't write that. I couldn't have. Tonight, as I sit here in the blue glow of my laptop, I've made a decision. I'm going to unlock the hatch. I'm going to climb into the attic with a flashlight and a phone, and I'm going to see for myself what is up there. What has been up there all along, maybe, waiting in the dark. Part of me knows this is exactly what it wants. If it exists at all. If anything exists beyond the fever dream my life has become. But I can't keep living like this, suspended between knowing and not knowing, sanity and its opposite. I need an answer, even if the answer breaks me. The clock on my phone reads 3:41 a.m. I can hear the scraping again, faint but unmistakable, like something dragging itself across the floor toward the hatch. Toward me. In 6 minutes, the notification will come. This time, I'll be there to meet it. I'm reaching for the first padlock now. The metal is cold against my fingers, colder than it should be, and I realize my hands are shaking. Above me, the scraping stops. The silence that follows is vast and patient. The silence of something that has been waiting for this moment far longer than I've been alive. I think I can hear it breathing now. Or maybe that's just me. I'm not sure I know the difference anymore. Story 6. The key felt wrong in my hand the moment the landlord pressed it into my palm. Cold in a way metal shouldn't be cold. Not the chill of inanimate things, but something deeper. Something borrowed from places light doesn't reach. I should have paid attention to that. I should have paid attention to a lot of things. The apartment was cheap. Suspiciously cheap for this part of the city, where even closet-sized studios commanded prices that made accountants weep. 3 bedrooms, hardwood floors, bay windows overlooking the park, all for half what my previous shoebox had cost me. The landlord, a gaunt man with eyes that never quite met mine, had shuffled through the showing with the enthusiasm of someone attending their own funeral. When I asked why the rent was so low, he mumbled something about market fluctuations and practically fled the moment I signed the lease. It was the previous tenant who left me the note. I found it tucked beneath the bathroom mirror, folded into a tight square as if the person who'd written it wanted to make themselves as small as possible. The handwriting was cramped, urgent, the pen having pressed hard enough to leave grooves in the paper. Just one sentence, underlined 3 times. Never speak to her if she calls you from the hallway. I laughed when I read it. The nervous, dismissive laugh of someone who wants very badly to believe they're dealing with a prank, a joke left behind by a tenant with a twisted sense of humor. I crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash. That night, I slept the dreamless sleep of the exhausted, surrounded by unpacked boxes and the unfamiliar shadows of my new home. The second night, I began to notice the silence. It wasn't ordinary silence, not the mere absence of sound that blankets a room when the world goes quiet. This was a presence of silence, thick and deliberate, the kind that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware of the blood rushing through your own veins. The building was old, a pre-war relic of crumbling plaster and radiators that clanged like distant church bells. Yet after midnight, every sound seemed to retreat, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I lay in bed those first nights, staring at the ceiling, listening to nothing. The ceiling fan spun in lazy circles, casting slow-moving shadows across the cracked plaster. I told myself the stillness was peaceful. I told myself a lot of things. On the third night, she called. I was hovering at the edge of sleep, that liminal space where consciousness frays and reality becomes negotiable. The sound started so softly I convinced myself it was part of a dream. A woman's voice, melodic and distant, drifting through the darkness like smoke. She was humming something, a tune I almost recognized, the melody threading through the walls as if the building itself were singing. Then the humming stopped, and she spoke. "Hello?" The word hung in the air, suspended by its own impossible sweetness. The voice came from the hallway beyond my bedroom door. I was certain of it. Close. Perhaps just on the other side of the wall. But there was something wrong with it. Something my sleeping mind hadn't registered, but my waking one understood immediately. The voice had no echo. In that old building with its high ceilings and hardwood floors, every sound bounced and reverberated. But her voice absorbed into the silence like water into sand. "I know you're there." I sat up in bed, heart hammering against my ribs. My mouth opened. Instinct, nothing more. The reflexive response of someone addressed in the dark. But before any sound could escape my lips, I remembered the note. The crumpled warning I'd dismissed as a joke. And something cold and ancient seized my throat. freezing the words before they could form. I didn't sleep again that night. The days that followed developed a strange rhythm. Sunlight would flood through the bay windows, warming the hardwood floors and chasing shadows from the corners, and I would feel foolish, paranoid. I was a grown man, a rational adult with a graduate degree and a respectable career in data analysis. I didn't believe in ghosts or hauntings or things that whispered from hallways in the dead of night. The voice had been a dream, I decided. Hypnagogic hallucination, the brain's strange theater between waking and sleeping. But then night would fall, and the silence would return. And with it, always, eventually, came her. She didn't call every night, at first. Sometimes days would pass without incident, and I would begin to relax, to believe the worst was over. I would lie in bed and read by lamplight, the radiator clanging its familiar lullaby, and convince myself that whatever strangeness had infected my first weeks in the apartment had passed. But she always came back. "Are you lonely?" Her voice would slide beneath my door like a draft, cold and intimate. I would feel it against my skin before I heard it, a whisper of sensation that raised the hair on my arms and sent ice down my spine. "I heard you crying last night." I hadn't cried. Had I? The boundaries of my days began to blur. I found myself questioning memories that should have been solid, wondering if the fatigue was distorting more than my perception. I stopped sleeping more than an hour or two at a time, jerking awake at the slightest sound, straining to hear footsteps that never came. Because that was the thing. There were never footsteps. No creak of floorboards, no rustle of fabric. Just the voice, arriving without preamble, speaking without source. "I've been waiting for you for such a long time." I began to investigate during the day. The hallway outside my apartment was unremarkable. Faded wallpaper in a pattern of interlocking diamonds, brass fixtures dulled by decades of polish, doors spaced evenly along its length. 5 apartments on my floor, including mine. I made excuses to meet my neighbors, borrowed cups of sugar, asked about the building's quirks, invented reasons to knock on doors. An elderly couple lived at the end of the hall, retired school teachers who kept to themselves and complained about the cold. A young professional across from me, rarely home, always rushing between shifts at the hospital. And next to me, in 4C, nothing. The door was locked, the windows dark. When I asked the landlord about it, he went pale and changed the subject. When I pressed, he said only that the unit had been vacant for years, that the previous tenant had left unexpectedly and no one had wanted it since. I did not ask what had happened to them. The paranoia crept in slowly, the way winter crept into old buildings, through cracks and gaps I hadn't known existed. I started seeing patterns that weren't there, the way shadows pooled in certain corners, the angle at which afternoon light fell through my windows, the rhythm of the radiators clanging. I became convinced that something was watching me, studying my routines, learning the architecture of my days. Sleep deprivation does strange things to the mind. Colors became too bright, sounds too sharp. I would catch movement in my peripheral vision, a flicker, a suggestion of something retreating around corners. But when I turned to look, there was nothing. The walls of my apartment, once solid and reassuring, seemed to breathe at the edges of my perception, expanding and contracting in time with that terrible silence. I began to doubt my own senses. Had I really heard her voice? Or was it merely the building settling, the old pipes and ancient wood speaking in their own language? Was there a woman at all? Or had my mind conjured her from loneliness and fatigue, a phantom born from the stress of new surroundings and too many sleepless nights? The note offered no answers. I had retrieved it from the trash, smoothing it flat and studying the handwriting as if it might reveal some hidden message. But it remained stubbornly mundane, just ink and paper, and a warning I couldn't verify. 3 weeks into my tenancy, she began using my name. "I miss you." I froze in the darkness, every muscle locked rigid. My name, a name I hadn't told anyone in the building, that I hadn't spoken aloud since moving in, wrapped in her impossible voice and delivered through my door like a gift. "You used to talk to me, don't you remember?" I didn't remember. I couldn't remember. And yet, in the hollow hours before dawn, a terrible uncertainty took root. What if I had spoken to her? What if the exhaustion had finally cracked something vital, had erased portions of my nights the way old film erases itself? I examined my apartment for evidence, searching for signs of conversations I couldn't recall. I checked my phone, my notes, the digital breadcrumbs of my daily existence. Everything appeared normal. But normal had lost its meaning. The investigation took a darker turn when I discovered the photographs. They were hidden in the back of my bedroom closet, in a shoebox I had assumed was empty. A dozen Polaroids, their edges curled with age, their colors faded to sepia ghosts. They showed the apartment, my apartment, but different. The furniture was old, mismatched. The walls bore different paper, and in every photograph, there was a woman. She stood with her back to the camera in each image, her face never visible. Long hair, dark and lustrous, spilling over shoulders draped in fabrics I couldn't date. She was positioned in doorways, framed in windows, standing at the edge of frames as if she had just arrived or was about to leave. The photographs had been taken over time. The changing light through the windows, the seasonal decorations, the gradual accumulation of belongings told a story of months, perhaps years. In the final photograph, she was standing in my hallway. Just visible beyond my door, which stood open in the image, she appeared to be turning, beginning the rotation that would finally reveal her face. But the photograph ended where her movement began, leaving only the suggestion of features in the blur. I called the landlord. He didn't answer. I called again and again, until finally I drove to his office downtown. The building was empty. A note on the door said he had retired suddenly, moved out of state, left no forwarding address. The night I almost broke, she stopped calling. I lay awake for hours, straining to hear her voice, dreading it and desperately wanting it in equal measure. The silence was absolute. No humming, no whispers, no sweet and terrible invitations from the hallway. Just the radiator, the fan, and the thunder of my own heartbeat. I should have been relieved. I wasn't. Instead, I found myself moving toward the door. My feet carried me across the cold floor as if they belonged to someone else, as if my body had made a decision my mind refused to acknowledge. I stood before the door, hand hovering over the knob, and I felt her presence on the other side, a density in the air, a patient attention focused entirely on me. I know you can hear me. My voice. I had spoken. The words had emerged without permission, torn from my throat by a need I couldn't name. And the moment they left my lips, I understood my mistake. I understood what the note had tried to warn me about. The silence on the other side of the door shifted. It became something else. Not absence, but anticipation. The coiled stillness of a predator who has finally lured prey within reach. And then, slowly, terribly, I heard something I had never heard before. Footsteps. They approached the door from the outside, soft and deliberate, each one placed with infinite care. I heard the creak of old floorboards, the rustle of fabric, the slight whisper of breath. She was there. She had always been there. And now, because I had spoken, because I had acknowledged her presence, she was coming. The doorknob began to turn. I don't remember what happened next. There's a gap in my memory, a void that swallows the hours between that turning doorknob and the gray light of dawn. I woke on my bathroom floor, curled into a fetal position, my cheek pressed against cold tile. The apartment was silent. The door was closed. But the photographs were gone. Every single one, vanished from the shoebox as if they had never existed. And in their place, a new note, written in handwriting that looked almost, but not quite, like mine. She knows you now. You belong to the hallway. I still live here. I don't know why. Perhaps I can't leave. The thought of packing, of calling movers, of explaining to anyone why I need to go feels impossible, blocked by something I can't articulate. Perhaps I don't want to leave. Perhaps some part of me, the part that spoke to her that night, is still waiting for her to speak again. She hasn't called since that night. The silence has returned to being ordinary silence, the kind that's merely the absence of sound. I sleep through the night now, dreamless and deep, waking each morning with a strange peace I don't trust. But sometimes, when I pass the mirror in my hallway, I see movement in the glass. A figure standing just behind me, dark hair spilling over shoulders, face perpetually turned away. And sometimes in the stillness before sleep, I hear my own voice whispering words I don't remember choosing. Hello. I know you're there. The previous tenant warned me not to speak to her, but no one warned me what happens when you become her instead. Story 7. The grandfather clock in the hallway stopped working the night I arrived. Its pendulum hung motionless behind the glass, frozen at 3:17 a.m. I should have paid attention to that. I came to this farmhouse seeking silence, the kind that city apartments can never provide, the kind that swallows your thoughts whole and lets you breathe again. My therapist had suggested it after months of insomnia, after the panic attacks became indistinguishable from my waking hours, after I started seeing shapes in my peripheral vision that dissolved the moment I turned to face them. You need rest, she had said, scribbling something on her notepad. Real rest. Away from everything. The rental listing described it as charmingly isolated, which I now understand was realtor code for you will be utterly alone. The nearest neighbor lived 8 miles down a dirt road that turned to mud whenever it rained. The property sat at the edge of an overgrown wheat field, surrounded by a ring of oak trees so ancient their branches had grown together into a nearly impenetrable wall of bark and shadow. On my first night, I slept better than I had in years. The mattress was old but firm, the sheets smelled faintly of lavender, and the darkness outside my window was absolute. No streetlights, no passing headlights, nothing but the thick, velvet black of rural emptiness. I woke at dawn feeling almost human again, and I spent the day exploring the property, cataloging its quiet charms. The rusted weather vane shaped like a rooster, the stone well covered with rotting boards, the cellar door chained shut with a padlock so corroded I couldn't have opened it if I'd wanted to. It was on the second night that the knocking began. I don't know what pulled me from sleep. One moment I was submerged in dreamless dark, and the next I was sitting upright in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs like something desperate to escape. The room was cold, far colder than it should have been, given the summer heat that had pressed down on the house all day. My breath misted in front of my face, a pale ghost hovering in the moonlight that leaked through the curtains. Then I heard it. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate, each one separated by exactly 2 seconds of silence. Knock, knock, knock. They came from the front door, down the hall and through the living room, but they sounded closer somehow, as if the house itself was conducting the vibration directly into my bones. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I lay there with my blankets clutched to my chest like a frightened child, listening for footsteps, for the creak of a floorboard, for any sound that might indicate someone was actually standing on my porch. Nothing. The silence that followed was worse than the knocking. It had a quality to it, a texture, thick and expectant, like the air before a storm. I stayed frozen in that position until the first gray fingers of dawn crept beneath my curtains, and only then did I find the courage to investigate. The porch was empty. The dirt path leading to the house showed no footprints except my own from the previous day. The wheat field stretched endlessly in every direction, unmarked and undisturbed. I checked the locks on the door 3 times, then 4, then 5, and I told myself it had been a dream, the kind that bleeds into waking, that leaves you unsure where sleep ends and reality begins. I made coffee and sat on the porch and watched the sun climb higher, and by noon I had almost convinced myself. Almost. That night I stayed awake. I sat in the living room with every light in the house blazing, a book open on my lap that I couldn't bring myself to read. The words kept blurring, rearranging themselves into patterns that made no sense. I checked my phone obsessively, watching the minutes crawl toward midnight, then past it, then into the small hours where time seems to move differently. At 2:45, I began to feel foolish. At 3, I was certain I had imagined the whole thing. At 3:17, the knocking came again. Knock, knock, knock. I was on my feet before the third knock had finished, crossing the living room in 3 strides, my hand closing around the doorknob. I yanked it open, ready to confront whoever was playing this sick joke, ready to scream at them, to chase them down if I had to. The porch was empty. I stood there in the doorway, the night air cold against my face, staring at nothing. The wheat field lay still under a moonless sky, the oak trees rising like silent sentinels at its edges. No movement. No sound except the distant hum of insects and the frantic pounding of my own pulse in my ears. But there was something else, a smell. Faint at first, then stronger, something sweet and rotting, like fruit left too long in the sun, like flowers decomposing in stagnant water. It seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, coating the inside of my nostrils, settling on the back of my tongue. I slammed the door and locked it. Then I pushed the couch against it. Then I sat in the far corner of the room with my back against the wall and my knees drawn to my chest, and I stayed there until morning. I should have left. That's what any reasonable person would have done. But I had paid for 6 weeks in advance, and the thought of returning to my apartment, to the noise, the crowds, the constant assault of stimulation, filled me with a dread that somehow exceeded my fear of the knocking. So I stayed. I told myself I would document it, approach it rationally. I set up my phone to record the front door. I bought a motion sensor light from the hardware store 40 miles away and installed it on the porch. I sprinkled flour on the steps, thinking I could catch footprints. The third night, I watched the recording. At 3:17 a.m. exactly, the 3 knocks came. The motion sensor didn't trigger. The flour remained undisturbed. On the video, I could see the door. Nothing but the door, painted white and slightly warped in its frame. And I could hear the knocking, clear as anything. But there was nothing visible that could have produced it. The sound seemed to come from inside the door itself, as if the wood were simply deciding to make that noise. I played it back 7 times. On the 8th viewing, I noticed something that made me stop the video and hurl my phone across the room. Just before the first knock, in the bottom right corner of the frame, there was a shadow. It moved. Just a flicker. Just a shifting of darkness against darkness. But it moved in a way that shadows don't, against the grain of the moonlight, contrary to the physics of the world I thought I understood. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. My thoughts began to fragment, to scatter like dead leaves in a wind I couldn't feel. I found myself losing time, standing in the kitchen with no memory of how I got there, staring at walls for hours that felt like minutes, forgetting to eat until my hands shook and my vision swam. The knocking became the axis around which my entire existence rotated. I started waking at 3:15, my body anticipating it, tensing for it, craving it in some sick way I couldn't explain. On the 6th night, I tried talking to it. I stood at the front door at 3:16, my forehead pressed against the cool wood, and when the knocking came, 3 measured blows that I felt reverberate through my skull, I whispered into the grain, "What do you want?" The silence that followed was different. It had weight to it, presence, like someone holding their breath on the other side. I pressed harder against the door, straining to hear, and for a moment, just a moment, I could have sworn I heard something whisper back. My name, not spoken aloud, but placed in my mind, inserted there like a splinter, like something that had always been there and was only now making itself known. I reeled back from the door, my hands clapped over my ears, and I screamed until my throat was raw. The next morning, I found scratches on the inside of the door, 3 parallel lines, running vertically from the lock to the floor. They looked like they had been made by fingernails. I knew they hadn't been there before. I knew it with the same certainty I knew my own reflection. But when I looked down at my hands, I saw that 2 of my fingernails were broken and bleeding. I called my therapist. The connection was terrible. The farmhouse sat in a cellular dead zone, and I had to walk a quarter mile down the dirt road just to get a single bar. I told her about the knocking, about the recording, about the scratches, and as I spoke, I heard how it sounded. I heard the tremor in my voice, the edge of hysteria that I couldn't quite suppress. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then she asked if I had been taking my medication. I couldn't remember. The pills were in my bag. I checked as soon as I got back to the house, but the bottle was nearly full. I should have been halfway through it by now. The days had become so slippery, so difficult to distinguish from one another, that I couldn't recall whether I had taken them or not. I swallowed 2 immediately, then sat on the edge of my bed and tried to reconstruct the past week in my mind. The memories were there, but they felt distant, observed rather than experienced. I remembered the first night's peaceful sleep. I remembered the knocking. I remembered the video, the shadow, the whisper of my name, but I also remembered other things. Things that didn't fit. Things that couldn't have happened. I remembered walking to the wheat field at midnight and lying down among the stalks. I remembered pressing my palms against the cellar door and feeling something press back. I remembered standing at the window of my bedroom and seeing a figure standing at the edge of the oak trees, perfectly still, watching the house. Watching me. Had those been dreams? Had any of it been real? The distinction seemed increasingly meaningless. The knocking came every night at 3:17, as reliable as clockwork, and whether it existed in the physical world or only in the crumbling architecture of my mind, it was tearing me apart just the same. On the 12th night, I opened the door. I don't know why. Some part of me had simply surrendered, to curiosity, to exhaustion, to the hypnotic pull of repetition. The knocking came, 3 perfect blows, and instead of cowering or screaming or pressing myself against the wood to listen, I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door wide open. The porch was not empty. A figure stood there, or perhaps stood is the wrong word. It occupied space in a way that defied standing, that suggested something between presence and absence. It had no clear edges, no distinguishable features. It was a darkness that the moonlight bent around, a hole cut in the fabric of the night. And yet I knew, with a certainty that transcended sight, that bypassed my senses entirely and lodged itself directly in my marrow, that it was looking at me. We stayed that way for what felt like hours. The figure on the porch, me in the doorway, the threshold between us humming with some charge I couldn't name. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. My tongue felt thick, numb, foreign. Then the figure raised one hand, if it was a hand, if anything about it could be called by human terms, and pointed past me, into the house, into the hallway, toward the grandfather clock. I turned slowly, terrified of looking away from the presence on my porch, but unable to resist the compulsion. The clock still hung there, its pendulum frozen, its face locked at 3:17. But something was different. Something I hadn't noticed before, or something that hadn't been there until this moment. The glass case was cracked, not shattered, but webbed with fractures, as if something had been pressing against it from the inside for a very long time. When I turned back to the door, the porch was empty. I left the next morning. I packed my bags in a frenzy, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip my suitcase. I didn't bother to clean, to close the windows, to do any of the things the rental agreement specified. I drove the 8 miles to the main road in half the time it should have taken, my tires kicking up rooster tails of mud, and I didn't look back once. It's been 3 weeks now. I'm back in my apartment, surrounded by the noise and light I once found so oppressive. I've been taking my medication religiously, setting alarms to remind myself, checking off each dose in a notebook I keep by my bed. My therapist says I'm making progress. She says the hallucinations, if that's what they were, will fade with time and proper treatment. She says the mind has remarkable powers of recovery, that trauma and sleep deprivation can conjure demons that feel utterly real. But every night, I wake at 3:15. And every night, I lie in the darkness of my city bedroom, listening. The knocking hasn't come. Not yet. But sometimes, when the silence stretches long enough, I could swear I hear something else. The faint, rhythmic ticking of a clock that isn't there. Its pendulum counting down the seconds toward an arrival I can no longer outrun. Last night, I noticed something that made me sit up in bed, my heart seizing in my chest. The digital clock on my nightstand had frozen. It read 3:17. And somewhere, very close, closer than the front door, closer than the hallway, I heard 3 soft knocks. Inside the walls. Knock, knock, knock. Story 8. The smell hit me first. A wet, organic sweetness like rotting flowers left too long in stagnant water. I had been prying the last board from the wall when that scent crawled into my nostrils and lodged itself somewhere deep in my brain, in that primitive place where fear still remembers what it means to be prey. I should have stopped there. I should have nailed the boards back, painted over them, and never spoken of this again. But curiosity is a kind of hunger, and I had been starving for answers ever since I'd bought this house 3 months ago. The renovation had started innocently enough. The guest bedroom on the second floor needed work, peeling wallpaper, warped floorboards, a persistent dampness that no amount of ventilation seemed to cure. My wife had left me 18 months prior, and I'd purchased this Victorian fixer-upper as a form of therapy, a way to rebuild something when everything else had crumbled. The house was over 100 years old, situated on 2 acres of overgrown land, at the edge of a town that seemed to be slowly forgetting it existed. I'd been scraping away layers of wallpaper when my putty knife struck something hollow. The sound was wrong. Not the solid thunk of plaster, but a resonant knock that suggested empty space beyond. I pressed my ear against the wall and heard nothing, yet felt something. A subtle vibration, like the memory of a heartbeat. That's when I noticed the seams. 4 faint lines in the plaster, forming a rectangle approximately 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall. Someone had covered something here. Someone had hidden something. I told myself it was probably an old window that had been boarded up decades ago, common practice in old houses to improve insulation, or because the original glass had broken. I retrieved my pry bar and began working at the edges of what I now recognized as wooden boards beneath a thin layer of plaster. The first board came away with a groan that seemed almost human. Behind it, I found darkness, not the ordinary darkness of an enclosed space, but a darkness that seemed to have texture, depth, a presence of its own. I pulled away another board, then another, and finally the last one, a window. The glass was old, with that subtle waviness of hand-blown panes, and it was remarkably clean despite having been sealed away for what must have been generations. Through it, I could see a room. That's when the wrongness truly registered. I had studied the original floor plans before purchasing the house. They were included in the historical records at the county clerk's office. I had walked every inch of this building, measured rooms, counted walls. The guest bedroom where I stood shared its northern wall with the upstairs hallway. There was no space between them. There couldn't be a room there. And yet, through the glass, I saw one. The room beyond the window was small, perhaps 10 feet by 8 feet. The walls were covered in a faded floral wallpaper. Roses, I thought, though the pattern seemed to shift when I looked at it too long, the flowers appearing to slowly unfurl or close, depending on where my gaze fell. A single wooden chair sat in the center of the space, facing the window, facing me. There was no other furniture, no door that I could see, just the chair, the wallpaper, and shadows that gathered in the corners with an almost deliberate quality. I pressed my face closer to the glass. That's when I noticed the wallpaper was moving, not the pattern, the paper itself. It pulsed almost imperceptibly, as if something behind it was breathing. I watched for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, my breath fogging the old glass, my heart performing a strange syncopated rhythm against my ribs. I pulled away. The fogged circle where my breath had touched the glass remained. And then, as I watched, a second fog circle appeared beside it. From the other side, I told myself there had to be an explanation. Old houses settle. Glass can trap air between panes that releases slowly, creating the illusion of breath. The wallpaper's movement was simply drafts finding their way through century-old construction. The room itself must be an architectural anomaly, a space created by renovations I hadn't been informed of, a pocket of the house that somehow didn't appear on the original plans. I spent the next 3 days researching the property's history. The house had been built in 1887 by a local physician, whose name appeared nowhere in the records except as the original owner. He had lived there alone for 31 years before the property was transferred, not sold, to a succession of owners who never seemed to stay more than a few years. The Historical Society had a photograph of the house from 1920, and when I examined it with a magnifying glass, I could count the windows on the second floor. There was one more than there should have been. It was there, in the photograph, the window to the impossible room. Clearly visible, not boarded up, a dark rectangle of glass that seemed to absorb the sepia light rather than reflect it. But no one had ever documented what was behind it. No floor plan, no renovation record, no notation anywhere that this room existed. I returned to the guest bedroom that evening with a flashlight. The window was still there, the room beyond it unchanged. The chair still faced me. The wallpaper still breathed. I couldn't deny it now. I had watched it for too long to pretend otherwise. And there was something else. A handprint. On the inside of the glass, barely visible until my flashlight hit it at just the right angle. A handprint pressed against the window from within, the fingers long and tapered, the palm large enough that it must have belonged to someone tall. Someone who had stood exactly where the chair now sat and pressed their hand against the glass. The print was fresh. There was no dust on it. Sleep became difficult. I would lie in bed on the first floor and listen to the house breathe around me, its settling groans and whispered creaks. And sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, I would hear something else, a rhythmic sound from above, a tapping. Not random, not the erratic noise of branches against windows, but deliberate, patient. 3 taps, a pause, 3 more taps, another pause. I never went upstairs at night. I told myself it was because the stairs were treacherous in the dark, that I might trip and injure myself. But the truth was simpler and more shameful. I was afraid of what I might see through that window in the darkness. During the day, however, my obsession grew. I measured the walls from the hallway side, then from inside the guest bedroom, then from the room on the other side of the hall. The mathematics were impossible. There was no space for a room between them. The walls met exactly where they should, sharing the same structural supports, the same plumbing, the same electrical wiring I had traced through the house during my renovation planning. The room beyond the window could not exist. And yet, each time I looked through the glass, it was there, waiting. On the 7th day after my discovery, I decided to break the window. I don't know what compelled me. Perhaps I needed proof that the glass was real, that my hands could shatter it, that the room beyond would reveal itself as nothing more than a trick of light and old construction. Perhaps I simply needed to do something, to take action against the growing sense that I was no longer alone in my own house. I chose a hammer from my toolbox, approached the window and raised my arm to swing. The chair was no longer empty. Someone was sitting in it. A figure, indistinct in the strange half-light of that impossible room, slumped slightly forward as if in sleep or contemplation. I couldn't make out features. The light seemed to bend around them, as if even photons were reluctant to touch whatever occupied that chair. But I could see enough to know it was shaped like a person. It was positioned facing me, and as I watched, frozen with the hammer still raised above my head, the figure's head slowly lifted. I didn't see eyes. I didn't need to. I felt them. A weight of attention pressed against me, a scrutiny so intense that my skin prickled with phantom sensations. The feeling of fingers trailing along my arms, my neck, my face. The figure was studying me with the same obsessive focus I had been directing at the room, but it had been watching longer. Much longer. I dropped the hammer. It struck the floor with a thunderous crash that seemed to belong to a different reality, a world where cause and effect still functioned normally. I backed away from the window until I hit the opposite wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my vision tunneling. When I finally looked again, the chair was empty. I started sleeping in my car. The first night, I told myself it was a temporary measure, a way to clear my head and approach the situation rationally. The second night, I admitted I was terrified. By the third night, I was certain the house was watching me even from outside, its windows like eyes following my movements as I paced the overgrown driveway in the moonlight. My neighbor, an elderly man who lived a quarter-mile down the road, found me on the fourth morning, sitting on the hood of my car and staring at the second floor. He asked if I was all right, if I needed help, if perhaps I should speak to someone. I heard myself explaining about the room, the window, the figure in the chair. I watched his expression shift from concern to something else. Not fear exactly, but a wariness that suggested he had heard similar stories before. He told me that I wasn't the first owner to find that window. He told me that his grandmother had worked as a maid in the house back in the 1940s, and she had spoken of a room that wasn't there, a space between spaces, a place where the house kept its secrets. She had refused to enter the guest bedroom after a certain point. She had quit without notice and never spoken of it again, except once, to her grandson, many years later. She had described a figure in a chair, watching from behind glass that shouldn't exist. She had described the breathing wallpaper. She had described the handprint. I should have left. Anyone with a shred of self-preservation would have abandoned the property, accepted the financial loss, and never looked back. But I had already invested so much of myself in this house. Not just money, but time, hope, the desperate need to prove I could still build something after everything had fallen apart. And there was something else. Something I'm ashamed to admit. The room was calling to me, not with words, nothing so obvious, but I would find myself standing at the foot of the stairs, staring up toward the guest bedroom, with no memory of having walked there. I would wake in the night with my hand on the front doorknob, as if my body was trying to leave while my mind slept. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between waking and sleeping, I would hear a voice that wasn't quite a voice, a whisper that seemed to originate from inside my own skull, describing the room in intimate detail. The wallpaper roses were always blooming. The chair was always waiting. And I would always, eventually, take my seat. I'm writing this from the guest bedroom. It's nearly midnight and the window is uncovered, the glass clean and clear, the room beyond visible in the glow of a single lamp I've placed on the floor. I've been watching for hours, and the chair remains empty. The wallpaper breathes, the shadows gather and disperse in their corners, and I can feel the attention, the weight of invisible eyes, pressing against me like hands. I've started to notice something that troubles me more than anything else. The guest bedroom is getting smaller. Not rapidly, not in any way I can measure with tools, but the walls are closer than they were a week ago. The window takes up more of the wall than it should, and sometimes when I look through the glass, I see not the impossible room, but this room, my room, with a figure sitting in a chair in the center, facing the window, facing me. And the figure looks familiar. I've examined my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I've studied photographs of myself from before I moved here. The changes are subtle but undeniable. My eyes have grown larger, darker, set deeper in a face that seems thinner than it was. My fingers have lengthened. My posture has shifted, curving forward in a slump that reminds me of contemplation or prayer, or of waiting. I don't know anymore if I found the room, or if the room found me. I don't know if the figure in the chair is a warning of what I'm becoming, or a reflection of what I've always been. I don't know if this house is haunted, or if I am the haunting. If I have always been the one watching from behind glass that shouldn't exist, in a room that doesn't appear on any floor plan, in a space between spaces where time moves differently, and reality is just a suggestion. What I know is this. The wallpaper in the guest bedroom has started to develop a faint floral pattern. The walls breathe if I watch them long enough. And there is a chair now, sitting in the center of the room. I don't remember bringing it here, but it fits perfectly. And when I sit in it, facing the window, facing the impossible room beyond, I feel something I haven't felt in a very long time. I feel like I'm finally home. The handprint on the glass matches my own. I've checked. I just can't remember putting it there. Story 9. The smell hit me first. Not decay, exactly, but something older. The kind of dense mineral odor that seeps from stones that haven't seen sunlight in decades. I stood in the hallway of my new investment property, crowbar in hand, staring at the freshly exposed wall cavity where the first message waited for me. Don't open the basement. The letters were crude, smeared in charcoal across the wooden slats behind the plaster. They tilted downward at the end, as if the writer's hand had trembled. Or hurried. I laughed, a short, uncomfortable sound that echoed through the empty rooms. Some previous owner's idea of a joke, I told myself. Old houses carry strange histories. I'd bought this Victorian fixer-upper at an estate auction for a price that should have warned me. 3 stories of rotting grandeur on the outskirts of a town that had forgotten it existed. The realtor had mentioned the previous owner had been eccentric. She'd smiled when she said it, the way people smile when they mean something worse. That was 6 weeks ago. I found 17 messages since then. The second message appeared 3 days after the first. I was removing a water-damaged section of wall in the upstairs bathroom when my sledgehammer broke through into a hollow space between the studs. The flashlight on my phone illuminated more charcoal scrawl. It listens. Don't open the basement. Same handwriting. Same desperate slant. I photographed it, planning to show my contractor when he arrived the next morning. But that night, lying on my air mattress in the only finished room, I kept thinking about the word listens. Not waits or watches. Listens. As if whatever was down there tracked sound rather than sight. I found myself holding my breath without meaning to. The contractor never showed. His voicemail said he'd taken another job, something closer to the city. I called 4 others that week. 2 never returned my calls. 1 drove out, walked through the house, and left without explanation, his face pale and jaw tight. The 4th, an older man with decades of experience, made it as far as the kitchen before he stopped cold. He asked me if I'd been down to the basement yet. When I said no, the door was swollen shut, and I'd been focused on the upper floors. He nodded slowly. He told me some houses don't want to be fixed. Then he left, and I never saw him again. The messages multiplied as I worked. Every wall I opened seemed to contain another warning, each more urgent than the last. In the master bedroom, the door is not a door. Don't open the basement. Behind the parlor's decorative molding, it knows your name now. Don't open the basement. Inside a sealed closet that hadn't been accessed in what looked like 50 years. I can hear it breathing through the floorboards. Don't open the basement. I started cataloging them, photographing each one, noting the location, trying to determine a timeline. The handwriting was consistent. The same person had written all of them. But the tone shifted. The early messages were warnings, almost clinical. The later ones carried a frantic, desperate quality. Whoever had written them had been deteriorating. The rational part of my brain constructed explanations. A mentally ill previous occupant. An elaborate prank by local teenagers who'd broken in before the auction. Some kind of artistic installation left by an eccentric former owner. The realtor's word kept circling back to me. Eccentric. But rationality grows thin at 3 in the morning when you're alone in a house that groans with every gust of wind. When the shadows in the corners seem to shift when you're not looking directly at them. When you start to notice that the basement door, swollen in its frame, has begun to develop a fine tracery of cracks around its edges. Cracks that weren't there before. Cracks that look almost like fingernail marks from the other side. I began sleeping poorly. The dreams were always the same. I stood at the top of a staircase descending into absolute darkness, and from somewhere below came a sound like breathing. Wet, patient, aware. I would wake with my sheets soaked in sweat, convinced I could still hear it, that rhythmic, organic pulse coming from beneath the floorboards. During the day, I told myself it was the pipes, the house's ancient plumbing system, expanding and contracting with temperature changes. But I never ran the water at night, and the sound continued. I found the 18th message on a Wednesday. I'd been tearing out the kitchen cabinets, preparing to gut the entire room, When my pry bar slipped behind a section of backsplash and revealed a hollow space, inside, along with mouse droppings and the desiccated corpse of a wasp's nest, was another charcoal inscription. This one was different. I opened it. I opened it. I opened it. The words repeated, covering every visible surface of the hidden space, overlapping and intersecting until they became almost illegible. And beneath them, in smaller letters that I had to squint to read, "Now it opens me." I should have left. Every instinct told me to walk away, to eat the loss and never look back. But something kept me rooted to that house. Maybe it was stubbornness. I'd invested too much money to abandon the project. Maybe it was curiosity, that terrible human compulsion to understand. Or maybe, as I've come to suspect, the house simply wouldn't let me go. I started researching the property's history. The county records were sparse, but I found enough. The house had been built in 1887 by a railroad magnate who'd gone bankrupt within a year of completion. It changed hands several times after that, each ownership shorter than the last. The most recent owner, the eccentric one, had lived there for 37 years. He'd been found on the property by a mail carrier who'd noticed weeks of accumulated deliveries. Not in the basement, in the attic, curled in a corner, facing the wall, his fingernails worn down to nothing. The official cause was exposure and dehydration. He'd simply stopped. Stopped eating, stopped drinking, stopped moving, as if he'd been waiting for something or hiding from it. I tried to find photographs of him, but none existed in the public record. What I found instead was a journal, mentioned in passing in a historical society's newsletter about the property. The journal had been donated anonymously after the estate sale. I must have missed it by days. When I called the historical society, they told me the journal had been destroyed in a small fire that broke out in their archives. Electrical fault, they said. Only the one box affected. Only his box. The sounds from beneath the floor grew louder. Not just breathing anymore, something closer to whispers. Multiple voices layered over each other, speaking in a language I couldn't identify. Some nights I pressed my ear to the floorboards, straining to understand. Other nights I blasted music through portable speakers, trying to drown them out. Neither approach worked. The whispers seemed to exist at a frequency that bypassed my ears entirely, settling directly into my skull. I stopped going out. The grocery delivery driver who left supplies on my porch began looking at me strangely, and I realized I'd been losing weight. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed hollowed cheeks and dark circles that hadn't been there before. My eyes had taken on a fixed, staring quality that I didn't recognize. But what disturbed me most was the basement door. It had stopped being swollen. Where before I'd had to put my shoulder against it just to test the seal, now it sat loosely in its frame, waiting. I could see light, if you could call it that, seeping through the gaps, a pale luminescence that had no source I could identify. It pulsed gently, in time with the breathing. I found the 19th message behind my own bathroom mirror. I don't remember when I installed that mirror. It was there when I bought the house, I'm certain of it. But when I went to clean it one morning and it shifted in its mounting, revealing the wall behind, the charcoal letters were fresh. The dust hadn't settled on them yet. Don't open the basement. Don't open the basement. Don't open the basement. And then, in different handwriting, my handwriting, it's too late. I don't remember writing that. I don't remember writing any of it. But when I looked at my hands, charcoal dust blackened my fingertips. When I checked the crawl space behind the guest room wall, a space I'd already cleared and inspected, new messages covered every surface. All in my handwriting. All warnings I had no memory of creating. The worst part wasn't the lost time. It wasn't even the growing certainty that I'd been leaving these messages for myself, a breadcrumb trail of sanity leading nowhere. The worst part was realizing that the messages had stopped warning me not to open the basement. Now they were telling me to remember. Remember what you saw. Remember what it showed you. Remember why you can't leave. I sit in the hallway now, writing this by the light of a camping lantern. The electricity failed 3 hours ago, or 3 days ago. Time has become unreliable. The basement door stands open. I don't remember opening it, but it's open, and that pale light spills out across the floorboards like something liquid. The whispers have resolved into a single voice. My voice. It's calling my name from somewhere below, telling me to come down, to see what I've forgotten, to remember what I found. The walls are covered in my handwriting now. Every surface, floor to ceiling, layer upon layer of charcoal words. Some of them are warnings, some of them are pleas, and some of them, the freshest ones, are instructions. Go down, it's waiting. It's always been waiting. It's you. I don't know what's in the basement. I don't know if I've already been down there, if some part of me has visited that darkness and returned with memories I've locked away. I don't know if the voice calling my name is something else wearing my voice, or if it's the part of me that already knows the truth. What I know is this. The house is breathing around me now. The walls pulse gently in and out like the ribs of something vast and patient. The light from below has grown brighter, and in its glow, I can see my own shadow stretched across the floor. But it's not moving the way I'm moving. It's reaching toward the basement. It's already halfway down the stairs. And somewhere in the depths of this house, in a darkness that remembers everything I've forgotten, something is waiting for me to remember too. I'm going to put down this pen now. I'm going to walk to the basement door. I'm going to descend those stairs into whatever waits below. Not because I want to, because I've already done it. Again and again, night after night, in the hours I can't account for. The charcoal on my fingers tells me so. The messages on the walls, the ones I keep writing and forgetting, they tell me so. This isn't a haunting. It never was. It's a loop, and I'm about to close it. Final entry, found written on the interior of a sealed wall cavity, dated 3 weeks before the house was listed for auction. If you're reading this, you've already bought the house. You've already found the messages. You've already started losing time, hearing whispers, watching your shadow move on its own. I'm sorry. I tried to warn you. I tried to warn myself. The basement isn't a place. It's a state of being. It's what you become when you spend too long in a house that doesn't exist in one time. We wrote these messages, all of us, every owner, every version, trying to stop what's already happened. Don't open the basement, but you already have. You opened it the moment you walked through the front door. Welcome home. Story 10. The ceiling creaks at 3:17 a.m. I know the exact time because I've been watching the red digits on my alarm clock for the past hour, waiting for it to happen again. It always happens again. I moved into this building 8 months ago, drawn by the impossibly low rent and the promise of solitude. The landlord, a thin, hunched man with eyes that never quite met mine, had been almost too eager to hand over the keys. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the top floor was used for storage and would remain permanently locked. I didn't question it. I was escaping a failed relationship and a job that had hollowed me out from the inside. I wanted silence. I wanted to disappear. Be careful what you wish for. The building is old, one of those pre-war structures that seem to breathe with a life of their own. 5 floors, each containing a single apartment. I occupy the 4th. Below me lives an elderly woman I've seen only twice, shuffling to the mailboxes with a slowness that suggests each step might be her last. The 2nd and 3rd floors appear empty, their doors unmarked, their windows dark even at midday. The ground floor houses the superintendent's office, though I've never once seen anyone inside. And above me, the 5th floor, the locked floor, the floor that shouldn't have footsteps. I first heard them 3 weeks ago, a Thursday night, unremarkable in every way. I was reading in bed, the kind of mindless thriller that requires no emotional investment, when I became aware of a presence overhead. Not a sound exactly, not yet, but a pressure, as if the air in my bedroom had suddenly grown heavier. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, the unmistakable rhythm of someone pacing from one end of the room to the other. I told myself it was pipes. Old buildings have old pipes, and old pipes make strange noises. This explanation satisfied me for approximately 45 seconds, until the footsteps stopped directly above my bed and I heard, clearly, impossibly, the sound of someone sitting down, the creak of floorboards, the groan of weight settling, then nothing. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I approached the landlord. He lived somewhere off-site, reachable only through a phone number that went to voicemail more often than not. When he finally returned my call, his voice carried that same evasive quality I remembered from our first meeting. I told him I'd heard someone upstairs. There was a pause, too long, too heavy with unspoken meaning, before he assured me that was impossible. The 5th floor had been sealed for years. Structural concerns, he said. Nobody could access it, not even him. The only key had been lost decades ago. I wanted to believe him. I tried to believe him. But that night, the footsteps returned. And this time, they were accompanied by something else. A dragging sound. Something heavy being pulled across the floor, leaving grooves in my imagination. The sound moved from the far corner toward the center of the room above, pausing occasionally as if whoever, whatever, was responsible needed to rest. I lay frozen in my bed, blankets pulled to my chin like a child hiding from monsters. The dragging continued for what felt like hours, though my clock insisted only 20 minutes had passed. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, pregnant with anticipation, thick with the certainty that something was about to happen. Nothing did. Eventually, I slept. The human mind is remarkably adept at normalizing the abnormal. Within a week, I had almost convinced myself that the sounds were nothing more than acoustic anomalies. Echoes from adjacent buildings, perhaps, or the settling of ancient timbers. I developed a routine: earplugs at night, white noise during the day, and a steadfast refusal to look up at my ceiling. But the building had other plans. It started with small things. A cold spot near my bedroom door that hadn't been there before. The faint smell of something musty and organic that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. And the stairs? I began to notice that the stairwell leading up to the 5th floor was always colder than the rest of the building, as if the temperature dropped with each step toward that padlocked door. I found myself drawn to those stairs despite my fear. There's something seductive about the forbidden, about the locked door that begs to be opened. I would stand on the 4th floor landing, staring up at the final flight, my hand resting on the banister as if some magnetic force was pulling me upward. The door at the top was old wood, painted a green so dark it was almost black. The padlock that secured it looked newer, a modern addition to an ancient barrier. One evening, I climbed those stairs. I'm still not sure why. My legs moved of their own accord, carrying me upward while my rational mind screamed objections. The cold intensified with each step, wrapping around me like an unwelcome embrace. When I reached the landing, I could see my breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. I pressed my ear against the door. At first, there was nothing, just the silence of an empty room, or what I desperately hoped was an empty room. Then, so faint I might have imagined it, I heard breathing. Not the mechanical wheeze of ventilation or the whistle of wind through cracks. This was human breathing, slow and rhythmic, coming from just on the other side of the door. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran down those stairs so fast I nearly tripped, and I didn't stop until I was inside my apartment with every lock engaged. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped animal. My hands shook so violently, I could barely pour myself a drink. That night I heard the dragging again. But this time, it was accompanied by something new, a sound that made my blood crystallize in my veins. Scratching. Slow, methodical scratching, as if fingernails were being drawn across wood. It came from my ceiling, directly above my bed, and it continued for hours. When I finally gathered the courage to look up, I noticed something I had never seen before. A thin crack running across the plaster, hairline fractures spreading like veins from a central point, a point directly above my pillow. I stopped sleeping in my bedroom after that. The couch became my refuge, though even there I could hear the sounds. Muffled now, distant, but unmistakably present. I began keeping a journal, documenting every noise, every anomaly, every moment when reality seemed to warp at the edges. I told myself it was for evidence, something I could show a psychiatrist or a priest or whoever might eventually be called to sort through the wreckage of my sanity. Reading those entries now, I'm struck by how quickly my handwriting deteriorated. The early pages are neat, almost clinical in their precision. By the third week, the words have become jagged, letters running together, sentences trailing off into nothing. The neighbors became a source of obsessive speculation. I started watching the old woman downstairs, convinced she knew something she wasn't telling me. Her eyes, rheumy and pale, seemed to follow me with a knowledge that transcended the ordinary. One morning, as I passed her in the lobby, she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. Her skin was cold and papery against mine. She told me I should leave, that some buildings remember things, that some floors hold on to their history like a scar holds on to pain. Before I could ask what she meant, she released me and shuffled away, muttering in a language I didn't recognize. I wanted to chase after her, to demand answers. Instead, I stood frozen in the lobby, her words echoing in my mind. Some floors hold on to their history. What history? What had happened on that sealed fifth floor? The research took weeks. Libraries, city records, archived newspapers. I became a detective of the mundane, sifting through decades of documentation for any mention of this building. Most of what I found was unremarkable. Ownership records, building permits, the bureaucratic detritus of urban existence. Then I found the article, a small piece buried in a newspaper from 1962. A woman had disappeared from this building, from the fifth floor. She had lived alone, kept to herself, and one day simply vanished. Her apartment was found locked from the inside. Her belongings were untouched. No body was ever discovered. The case remained unsolved. The article mentioned one other detail that stopped my breath. Neighbors had reported hearing strange sounds in the weeks before her disappearance. Footsteps at odd hours, something heavy being dragged across the floor. I read that sentence 3 times, my hands trembling so badly the newspaper shook. The sounds I was hearing, they were the same, exactly the same, as if whatever had happened in 1962 was happening again, caught in an endless loop of repetition. Or as if something up there was trying to tell me something. The building has changed around me, or perhaps I have changed. The walls seem closer now, the shadows deeper. I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shapes that dissolve when I turn to face them directly. Sometimes, late at night, I hear my name being whispered from somewhere above. The voice is familiar, though I cannot place it. Female, I think. Soft and insistent, like a memory trying to surface. The superintendent's office remains perpetually empty, but I've noticed something disturbing. The nameplate on the door has changed. When I first moved in, it read, Building Management, in faded gold letters. Now it says something else, a name, I think, though the letters are too worn to decipher. I've tried photographing it with my phone, but the images always come out blurred, as if the camera refuses to capture what my eyes insist they're seeing. I've started talking to myself, long conversations about nothing, just to fill the silence. My voice sounds strange in this apartment, thin and reedy, as if the walls are absorbing it before it can reach my own ears. I asked myself yesterday if I was losing my mind. The question hung in the air, unanswered. The cracks in my bedroom ceiling have spread. They now form a pattern that almost resembles a face. Hollow eyes, a gaping mouth frozen in a silent scream. I've covered the ceiling with newspaper and duct tape, but somehow the pattern bleeds through. Every morning, I wake to find more tape on the floor, as if something is pushing from the other side. Last night, something changed. The footsteps above me stopped their usual circuit and moved toward my ceiling. Toward me. I heard the dragging sound, closer than ever, and then a new noise, the creak of a door opening. Impossible, I told myself. The 5th floor is sealed. The landlord said so. But the sound was unmistakable. Hinges groaning, wood scraping against wood, and then silence. A silence that lasted exactly 1 heartbeat. Then the footsteps began descending the stairs. I listened. paralyzed, as they moved from the 5th floor to the landing outside my door. Slow, deliberate, each step sending vibrations through the old building like a heartbeat. They stopped on the other side of my door. I could see shadows in the gap at the bottom, shifting, uncertain, as if someone was standing there, deciding what to do next. I waited. Minutes passed, or hours. Time had become meaningless. Eventually, the shadows withdrew, and the footsteps retreated back up the stairs. I heard the door above close, and then the building fell silent. This morning, I noticed something on my floor, just inside my front door. A piece of paper, yellowed and brittle, folded into a tight square. I opened it with shaking hands. It was a photograph, black and white, edges crumbling with age. A woman stood in what looked like a living room, staring directly at the camera. Her face was blurred, unrecognizable, but something about her posture suggested she was waiting for something, or someone. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting that was not my own, someone had written a single word. Soon. I should leave. I know I should leave. Every rational part of my brain is screaming at me to pack my things and run, to abandon this apartment and everything in it and never look back. But I can't. Something holds me here. Some thread connecting me to the floor above, to the woman who disappeared, to the sounds that seem increasingly meant for me alone. The ceiling above my bed has started to bulge. The cracks have widened into gaps through which I can see only darkness, a darkness that seems to breathe. Sometimes, when I stare too long, I think I can make out shapes in that darkness. A face, a hand, something waiting. The footsteps have stopped. The dragging has stopped. The entire building has fallen into a silence so complete it feels like the world is holding its breath. I know what comes next. I've known since the moment I heard that first footstep, weeks ago. Whatever lives on the 5th floor, whatever has been repeating its endless ritual for 60 years, has finally noticed me, has finally chosen me. Tonight, when the clock strikes 3:17, I'm going to climb those stairs. I'm going to face that padlocked door. And I'm going to find out, once and for all, what's been waiting for me all along. Either I'll discover the truth, or I'll become part of it. At this point, I'm no longer sure which possibility frightens me more. I found this journal 3 days after he disappeared. His apartment was locked from the inside. His belongings were untouched. The building superintendent claims no such person ever lived here. But I can hear the footsteps above my bed. They started last night. Story 11. And the first time I noticed the chair had moved, I blamed myself. It was a Tuesday morning. I remember because Tuesdays were supposed to be my good days, my structured days, the days when routine kept the formless anxiety at bay. I woke at 6:15 a.m. as always, and swung my legs over the edge of the bed to find the reading chair positioned exactly 3 inches closer to my nightstand than it had been the night before. 3 inches doesn't sound like much, but when you've lived alone for 11 years, when you've arranged every piece of furniture with obsessive precision because disorder breeds chaos and chaos breeds the kind of thoughts that medication can only dull, not silence, 3 inches becomes a continent. I convinced myself I must have moved it, perhaps during one of my increasingly frequent trips to the bathroom, perhaps in that fog state between wakefulness and sleep when the body operates on autopilot. Yes, that had to be it. But then it happened again. And again. My apartment occupies the 4th floor of a converted textile factory on the industrial edge of town. The building is over a century old, its bones groaning with the weight of decades, its hallways echoing with the phantom footsteps of workers long dead. I chose this place specifically for its isolation. My nearest neighbor lives 2 floors below, an elderly woman whose hearing aids create a buffer of silence between us. The fire escape outside my bedroom window has been rusted shut since before I signed the lease. There is one entrance, one exit, and I keep both deadbolts engaged at all times. No one comes in. No one can come in. And yet, the objects kept shifting. Small things at first. A coffee mug rotated 45 degrees on its coaster. A stack of books rearranged alphabetically when I distinctly remembered organizing them by color. The bathroom towel refolded into a shape I had never folded it into before. Each displacement was minor enough to dismiss, significant enough to gnaw at the edges of my certainty. I started documenting. I photographed every surface before bed, then compared the images upon waking. The differences were undeniable. A pen cap removed and placed beside the pen. My prescription bottle shifted from the left side of the sink to the right. The bedroom curtains opened exactly 2 inches wider than I had left them. Someone was in my apartment while I slept. The logical response would have been to contact the police, to demand an investigation, to insist that someone, anyone, explain the impossible. But I had traveled that road before, years ago, during what my therapist diplomatically called the episode. I had made accusations then too. I had been certain of intruders, of conspiracies, of a world arranged specifically to torment me. The medications they prescribed after my hospitalization had helped. I was better now, stable, functional. What if I was wrong again? This question tormented me more than the displacements themselves. I lay awake at night, paralyzed between two equally terrifying possibilities. Either someone was genuinely invading my space while I slept, or my mind was fracturing again, silently, insidiously, and I was too far gone to recognize the difference. I needed proof. Objective, irrefutable proof that existed outside my own unreliable perceptions. So I bought the cameras. They were high-definition devices, marketed for home security, equipped with infrared night vision and motion-triggered recording. I installed 3 of them, one facing the bedroom door, one covering the window and fire escape, one positioned to capture the majority of the room, including the bed where I lay each night, vulnerable, unconscious, completely unaware of what might be happening around me. The first night I barely slept. I kept glancing at the tiny red lights indicating active recording, finding strange comfort in their electronic vigilance. I woke to find nothing disturbed. The footage showed 8 hours of stillness, my body shifting occasionally beneath the sheets, the digital timestamp advancing steadily through the night. No intruders, no disturbances. I felt something close to relief. That feeling lasted exactly 48 hours. On the 3rd morning, I discovered my slippers had been placed neatly at the foot of the bed. I never place my slippers at the foot of the bed. I kick them off wherever I happen to be standing when exhaustion overtakes me, and they remain there until morning, scattered evidence of my surrender to sleep. But here they were, positioned with military precision, toes pointing toward the door, perfectly parallel to each other. My hands trembled as I accessed the camera footage. I watched myself fall asleep at 11:47 p.m. I watched the room remain motionless for the next 2 hours, and then, at exactly 2:03 a.m., the screen went black. Not dark, black. The absolute negation of light, a void so complete it seemed to absorb the glow of the timestamp still visible in the corner. The cameras have night vision. They can capture images in total darkness. But this was different. This was an absence that transcended mere darkness, a blackness that felt almost aggressive in its totality. The footage remained black for exactly 54 minutes. At 2:57 a.m., the image returned as suddenly as it had vanished. The room looked unchanged, but there, at the foot of the bed, my slippers had been arranged in their precise new configuration. I checked the other cameras. All 3 showed the identical pattern: clear footage, then perfect blackness at 2:03 a.m., then restored recording at 2:57 a.m. I checked the apartment's power records. No outages had occurred. I tested the cameras repeatedly throughout the day. They functioned flawlessly. Whatever was happening in my bedroom between 2 and 3 in the morning, the cameras could not see it. The following weeks became an exercise in methodical desperation. I replaced the cameras with different brands, more expensive models, devices specifically designed for extreme low-light conditions. The same result. I installed motion sensors that should have triggered the instant anything moved within their range. They recorded nothing during the blind hour, as I had come to think of it, despite the objects continuing to shift. I even borrowed a friend's old camcorder, purely mechanical, no digital components to malfunction, and positioned it facing my bed. The tape showed the same impossible blackness. Meanwhile, the displacements grew bolder. My keys would migrate from the nightstand to the dresser. My clothes would be refolded in drawers I knew I hadn't opened. Once I woke to find my bathroom mirror had been rotated, not adjusted, but physically removed from its mounting and rehung approximately 5 degrees off-center. Another morning, I discovered that every photograph in my bedroom had been turned to face the wall. I began to fear sleep itself. I started drinking coffee at midnight, setting alarms for every 20 minutes, doing everything possible to remain conscious through the blind hour. But the fatigue always won. No matter how determined I was to stay awake, I would find myself jerking alert at 3:30 or 4 a.m., the cameras showing their usual pattern of blackness between 2:03 and 2:57, another object inexplicably relocated. It was as though something new, as though it waited for my vigilance to fail, patient and persistent, absolutely certain that eventually I would surrender to unconsciousness. I told my therapist about the cameras, about the blackness, about the objects. She listened with the careful neutrality I had come to both appreciate and resent. When I finished, she asked whether I had considered that I might be moving the objects myself, that sleep disorders could cause ambulatory behavior without conscious memory. I told her about the cameras going black. I told her that all 3 went black simultaneously, at the exact same second, for the exact same duration. I told her that no sleepwalking explanation could account for that synchronicity. She suggested that perhaps I was manipulating the cameras myself, unconsciously, as part of the same sleep disorder. She said the mind was capable of elaborate self-deception, that dissociative states could create entire episodes of behavior the conscious mind refused to acknowledge. She did not say I was experiencing a psychotic break. She did not say my medication needed adjustment. But I could see the concern behind her professional composure, the way she wrote slightly longer notes than usual, the way she asked if I had been taking my prescriptions regularly. Yes, I told her. Yes, I had. Yes, I was fine. Yes, everything was fine. I did not tell her about what I had started to feel during the blind hour. The sensation began approximately 2 weeks after the camera blackout started. I would jolt awake, sometimes at 2:30, sometimes at 2:45, always within that 54-minute window when the cameras saw nothing. The room would be pitch dark despite my having left the lights on. I had started sleeping with every lamp blazing, hoping somehow to burn through whatever void descended upon my bedroom. And in that darkness, I would feel something watching me. Not see, feel. The awareness would settle over me like a physical weight, pressing against my chest, making each breath a conscious effort. I would lie perfectly still, eyes straining against blackness so complete it seemed to have texture, and I would know with absolute certainty that something was in the room with me, standing in the corner, sitting in the reading chair that kept moving, hovering just beyond the foot of my bed, watching. The first few times I screamed for the lights to return. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for any source of illumination, but the screen remained dark no matter how many times I pressed the power button. I grabbed the flashlight I had started keeping under my pillow, but it too refused to function. Whatever darkness filled my room during the blind hour was not merely an absence of light. It was something that devoured light, that consumed it, that rendered all my desperate attempts at illumination meaningless. And through it all, the presence watched. I began to understand that there were rules to this phenomenon. The watching thing never touched me. The objects it moved were never positioned to harm or obstruct. If anything, they seemed to be arranged with a disturbing thoughtfulness, placed exactly where they would be most useful when I woke. My slippers by the bed, my coffee mug closer to the edge of the counter, my medications organized by the order I needed to take them each morning. Whatever was watching me, whatever was rearranging my possessions with such careful attention, it was helping me. In its own incomprehensible way, it was taking care of me. This realization did not comfort me. It terrified me more than any malevolence could have, because malevolence I could understand. Malevolence I could fight against, flee from, report to authorities who might dismiss me as unstable, but would at least acknowledge the theoretical existence of dangerous intruders. But this quiet, attentive presence, This thing that watched over me in darkness while I slept and straightened my possessions with the care of a devoted servant. What was I supposed to do with that? Who would believe me? Who would even understand what I was trying to describe? Last night I decided to try one final experiment. I positioned myself in the reading chair instead of the bed. I held my phone in one hand, my flashlight in the other, my prescription bottle balanced on my knee as a kind of makeshift motion detector. I swore to myself that I would not sleep, that I would witness with my own eyes whatever descended at 2:03 a.m., that I would finally have proof, internal, personal, but proof nonetheless, of what was happening in my room. The clock read 2:02 a.m. I was awake. I was alert. I was watching. The clock read 2:03 a.m. And then, without transition, without any sensation of time passing, the clock read 2:57 a.m. 54 minutes had vanished. Not passed. Vanished. One moment I was staring at the timestamp with fierce concentration, and the next moment, nearly an hour had simply ceased to exist. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the mirror. My bathroom mirror, the one that had been rotated weeks ago, now faced directly toward the reading chair. And in its dim reflection, barely visible in the weak light that had finally returned to my room, I could see my own sleeping face. My eyes closed, my features slack, my body slumped in the chair, unconscious, vulnerable, utterly oblivious to whatever had transpired during the blind hour. But beside my reflection, there was something else. A shape. A suggestion. A darkness within darkness that seemed almost human-sized, positioned directly behind my sleeping form, angled as though it were leaning over my shoulder, watching my face with an intimacy that made my skin crawl. I blinked, and the shape was gone. I turned around and the room was empty. I checked the cameras and they showed their usual pattern of blackness, revealing nothing, explaining nothing, leaving me with nothing but my own increasingly fractured certainty. Tonight I will not set up cameras. I will not stay awake. I will not fight whatever comes for me during the blind hour. Instead, I have placed a notebook and pen on my nightstand, arranged with careful precision, positioned exactly where I always place them. And I have written a simple question on the first page. What do you want? I will leave the lights off. I will let the darkness come without resistance. I will surrender to sleep and hope that whatever watches over me will finally choose to answer. Part of me knows this is madness. Part of me recognizes that I am making decisions no stable person would make, that I am treating a possible delusion as though it were a real and present entity, that my therapist would immediately recommend hospitalization if she knew what I was planning. But there is another part of me, a part that grows louder with each passing night, that whispers with increasing confidence, that believes the presence is real, that believes it has always been here, waiting, watching, caring for me in ways I cannot comprehend, that believes the blind hour is not a malfunction of technology or a symptom of psychological collapse, but a window into something genuine, something impossible, something that has chosen me specifically for reasons I am only beginning to understand. Tomorrow morning, I will either wake to find my notebook untouched, confirming that all of this has been nothing but an elaborate construction of my deteriorating mind, or I will find an answer. I genuinely do not know which possibility frightens me more. Story 12. The first time someone mentioned it, I laughed. My cousin had come over to help me move some furniture around the apartment, a cramped two-bedroom unit on the third floor of a building that had seen better decades. The radiators clanked like bones in the walls, and the floorboards creaked with a consistency that suggested the place was breathing. I'd lived there for 7 months by then, long enough to stop noticing the peculiarities that had once kept me awake. We were in the living room, positioning my couch against the window, when my cousin stopped mid-sentence. His eyes fixed on something behind me, somewhere down the narrow corridor that connected the living room to the bedrooms. The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might be having a stroke. He told me there was someone standing at the end of the hallway. A figure, just standing there, watching us. I turned around. The hallway stretched before me, dim and empty, leading to the bathroom door at the far end. The overhead light had burned out weeks ago, and I hadn't bothered to replace it. Shadows pooled in the corners like spilled ink, but there was no one there. When I turned back, my cousin was already grabbing his jacket. He said he had to go, that he'd forgotten about an appointment. His hands were shaking. I remember thinking how strange it was, how his voice had gone thin and reedy, like someone speaking through a long tube. He left without finishing the couch. I didn't think about it again. Not really. People see things sometimes, tricks of light, shadows that resemble shapes. The brain is desperate for patterns, for faces, for the familiar architecture of human form. It was nothing. The second time was 3 weeks later. A colleague from work came over to drop off some documents I'd left at the office. She was a practical woman, the kind who kept spreadsheets of her grocery lists and never believed in horoscopes. We talked briefly at the door, and I invited her in for coffee. She declined, but as she handed me the manila folder, her gaze drifted past my shoulder. Her expression didn't change exactly. It was more like something behind her eyes flickered and went still. She asked who else lived with me. I told her I lived alone, had always lived alone. She nodded slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then she said she'd seen someone in the hallway, a figure standing very still, watching. She described it as a man, tall, with shoulders slightly hunched forward, as if leaning toward us. But she couldn't make out the face. The hallway was too dark, she said. The figure was too dark. I looked. Of course I looked. Nothing. She left quickly after that. And I noticed she didn't look back as she walked to the elevator. I stood in the doorway for a long time, staring down the corridor behind me, waiting for my eyes to adjust, waiting for some shape to materialize from the gloom. The radiator clanked, the floorboards settled. The apartment breathed its slow, ancient breath. I was alone. Over the following months, it happened 4 more times. Different visitors, different occasions, but always the same story. Someone standing at the end of the hallway, always watching, always still, always just behind me, just out of my sight, as if whatever it was knew exactly where my field of vision ended. My neighbor from downstairs mentioned it when she came up to complain about a leak. A friend from college saw it during a brief visit. The building superintendent spotted it while checking the radiator in my bedroom. Even the delivery man who brought my new mattress, a stranger with no reason to lie, asked if I had a roommate, because he'd seen someone standing back there in the shadows. Each time I turned around. Each time I saw nothing. I started to dread having visitors. Not because I believed them, I told myself I didn't believe them, but because of how they looked at me after. There was pity in their eyes, or fear, or something worse, a careful distance, as if I were a fragile thing that might shatter if they spoke too directly. They thought I was living with something. They thought I didn't know. But I knew my apartment. I knew every corner, every shadow, every creak and groan of its aging skeleton. I had walked that hallway 1,000 times in darkness, stumbling to the bathroom at 3 in the morning, shuffling to the kitchen for water. There was nothing there. There had never been anything there. I started leaving lights on. All the lights all the time until my electricity bill doubled. The hallway blazed with a harsh fluorescent glow that eliminated every shadow, every ambiguous corner where something might hide. When my neighbor visited again, I watched her face carefully, waiting for that familiar flicker of unease. She didn't look at the hallway. She looked at me. She asked if I was sleeping well. She said I looked tired, thin. She said my eyes had a strange quality to them, like I was looking at something far away even when I was looking right at her. I told her I was fine. The doubt crept in slowly, like water seeping through cracks in a foundation. I found myself pausing at the threshold of the hallway, listening for sounds that weren't there. I started checking the locks obsessively, the front door, the windows, the door to the small balcony that overlooked the parking lot. I bought a security camera and mounted it at the end of the corridor, aimed at the spot where everyone claimed to see the figure. I reviewed the footage every night. Hours of empty hallway, static and silent. the timestamp crawling forward in the corner of the screen. Nothing moved. Nothing appeared. The camera saw exactly what I saw. A narrow passage, a bathroom door, a stretch of unremarkable wall. Proof, I thought. Proof that there was nothing there, that my visitors were mistaken, that I was not living with something I couldn't see. But the doubt didn't leave. If anything, it grew stronger. I started to wonder why I couldn't see it. Everyone else could. Different people, different backgrounds, different levels of skepticism, and they all saw the same thing. A figure, a man, standing in the darkness, watching. What if the problem wasn't with them? What if the problem was with me? The thought gnawed at me in the quiet hours of the night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the radiator clank, and I wondered if something in my brain was broken. A blind spot, perhaps, a failure of perception that prevented me from seeing what was plainly there. I thought about those optical illusions where some people see a rabbit and others see a duck, and I wondered if I was somehow wired to see only the empty hallway, only the absence, while everyone else saw the truth. I stopped inviting people over. The apartment changed after that, or maybe I changed, and the apartment simply reflected what I had become. The walls seemed closer than before, the ceilings lower, the hallway longer. I found myself taking the long way around, through the kitchen, around the living room, just to avoid walking down that corridor. When I had to use the bathroom, I moved quickly, my eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to look at the shadows that gathered in my peripheral vision. Because there were shadows now. Even with all the lights on, even with the fluorescent glare bleaching every surface, I could feel them. They pressed against the edges of my awareness like something trying to get in. I would be cooking dinner and sense a presence behind me, a weight in the air, a subtle shift in temperature. I would be reading on the couch and catch a flicker of movement at the corner of my eye. I would be brushing my teeth and hear, beneath the sound of running water, something that might have been breathing. I never saw anything. I never saw anything directly. But I started to understand what my visitors had felt. That creeping certainty that you are not alone, that something is watching, that if you turned around fast enough you might finally catch a glimpse. I never turned around fast enough. Sleep became difficult. I would lie in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, my body rigid with a tension I couldn't name. The bedroom was at the end of the hallway, the door facing the corridor, and even with it closed I could feel the space beyond. It stretched out in my imagination like a dark throat, and I was lodged at the bottom of it, waiting to be swallowed. I started sleeping with the lights on, then with the television on, its blue flicker casting restless shadows across the walls, then with the radio playing, a low murmur of voices to fill the silence. I layered sound and light around me like armor, like protection, but it wasn't enough. Something was still there. Something was always there, patient and still, watching from the darkness I couldn't quite illuminate. I told myself I was being irrational. I told myself that the human mind is a haunted house, full of doors that open onto nothing, full of rooms we're afraid to enter. The figure wasn't real. It couldn't be real. It was a collective hallucination, a shared delusion, a strange trick of my apartment's architecture that fooled the eye. But if it wasn't real, why could I feel it? The night it happened, I had been awake for nearly 36 hours. I don't know why I couldn't sleep. The exhaustion was bone deep, a heaviness that dragged at my limbs and blurred my thoughts. But every time I closed my eyes, I felt it. That presence, that weight, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. It was like trying to sleep while someone stood over your bed, breathing quietly, waiting for you to drift off. I gave up around 2 in the morning. I turned on every light in the apartment, made a pot of coffee, and sat on the couch with the television playing some infomercial at low volume. The coffee